Tonight, I want to share with you 12 ancient stories, each one a gate through which wisdom passes like moonlight through paper screens. You need not remember them all, nor strain to grasp their meaning. Simply let them settle into you the way snow settles on a silent mountain, soft and without effort. We have the whole night ahead of us, and these stories have waited centuries. They can wait for your breath to slow, for your shoulders to soften into the pillows beneath you, for your mind to finally release its grip on the day that has passed. The first story begins, as so many things do, with someone who believed they knew everything, traveling a long road to discover they knew nothing at all. Let me take you to a monastery nestled in mountains, so ancient that the stones themselves seem to breathe with the rhythm of meditation. The monastery was small, unremarkable to those who passed by on the valley road below, just weathered wood and paper walls, a garden of raked gravel, and a master who had lived there so long that some said he had become part of the mountain itself. His name was Riku, though names matter little in this story. What mattered was that he had spent 40 years perfecting a single thing, the art of preparing tea. Not the drinking of tea, mind you, but the preparation. The precise temperature of water, the angle at which the whisk should turn, the moment when green powder and hot water become something more than their separate parts. People said that to watch him prepare tea was to witness meditation made visible, each gesture so complete unto itself that past and future dissolved, leaving only the eternal present of water meeting leaves. One autumn afternoon, when the maple trees had turned the mountainside into a tapestry of crimson and gold, a scholar arrived at the monastery gates. He was a man of considerable reputation, known throughout the province for his knowledge of Buddhist texts. He had studied at the greatest temples, memorized thousands of sutras, debated with the most learned monks. His mind was a vast library, each shelf stocked with concepts, interpretations, commentaries upon commentaries. He wore fine robes despite the dust of travel, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone who has accumulated much and knows it. He had come, he announced to the young monk who greeted him, to finally understand the essence of Zen. I have read everything, he explained, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. The Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the writings of Dogen and Hakuin and Bankei. I have studied the koans until I could recite them in my sleep, but I sense there is something more, some final piece of understanding that eludes me. I have heard that your master possesses this understanding, and I have traveled 3 days to receive his teaching. The young monk bowed and led him through the garden, where the gravel had been raked into patterns that suggested waves on an invisible ocean, and into the tea room, a space so simple it seemed to hold nothing but light and air. There, seated before a small hearth where a kettle whispered its song of approaching steam, sat Master Riku. The scholar bowed, though not as deeply as the young monk had bowed, and seated himself across from the master. Without a word, Riku began to prepare tea, his movements unhurried, as if he had all the time that had ever existed. He wiped the tea bowl with a cloth of raw silk. He measured the green powder with a bamboo scoop, each grain of tea seeming to matter. He ladled water from the kettle, testing its temperature with an attention that made even this simple act seem profound. The scholar watched for a moment, then began to speak. His words flowed like a river breaking through a dam, all the knowledge he had accumulated spilling forth. He quoted the Buddha, "The mind is everything. What you think you become." He explained his interpretation of this teaching, how thought creates reality, how consciousness shapes experience. He moved on to the concept of emptiness, reciting passages he had memorized, explaining the scholarly debates about sunyata, the various schools of thought, the historical context. Master Riku continued preparing tea, whisking the powder and water together in the bowl with a bamboo whisk, the gesture creating a soft sound like wind through grass. The scholar talked on, barely pausing for breath. He spoke of his studies, the temples he had visited, the teachings he had received. He asked questions but did not wait for answers, instead providing his own elaborate responses. He quoted Shunryu Suzuki, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's there are few. and then proceeded to explain in great detail what this meant, how it applied, why it mattered. The tea was ready. Riku lifted a second cup, simple earthenware, unglazed, the colour of the earth after rain, and began to pour. The scholar continued speaking, now describing his understanding of the tea ceremony itself, its symbolism, its relationship to Zen practice, the historical development of various schools of tea preparation. The master poured slowly, steadily, the green tea filling the cup. The scholar, warming to his subject, began to describe the specific teachings he hoped to receive, the gaps in his understanding he wished to fill, the questions that still troubled him despite all his study. The tea reached the rim of the cup. Still, Riku poured. The liquid spilled over the edge, running down the sides of the cup, pooling on the wooden tray beneath, dripping onto the woven mat. Still the master poured, his expression unchanged, as serene as the surface of a mountain lake at dawn. The scholar's words stumbled to a halt. He stared at the overflowing cup, tea now running off the tray onto the floor, steam rising from the small puddle forming on the wood. "Master," he said, his voice rising with agitation, "can't you see the cup is full? No more will go in. You're wasting the tea." For the first time, Riku looked up from his pouring, meeting the scholar's eyes. His gaze was gentle, without judgment, the way one might look at a child who has just discovered something obvious. He set down the kettle with the same unhurried grace with which he had lifted it. "Like this cup," he said, his voice quiet but clear as a bell in mountain air, "you are full of your own opinions and speculations. You overflow with knowledge, with concepts, with ideas about what Zen is and what enlightenment means. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" The words settled into the small room like snow settling on a winter garden. The scholar opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to explain that his knowledge was different, was necessary, was the foundation for deeper understanding. But something in the master's gaze, something in the simple truth of that overflowing cup, stopped the words before they could form. He looked down at the tea spreading across the floor, warm and fragrant and wasted, and saw suddenly the shape of his own mind so full, so crowded with accumulated wisdom, that nothing new could enter. Every teaching he had received, he had immediately stored in the vast library of his knowledge, labelled and catalogued and connected to everything else he knew. He had never simply received anything. He had always grasped it, possessed it, made it part of his collection of understanding. The master reached for a cloth and began, with the same deliberate attention he had given to preparing the tea, to wipe up what had spilled. "The beginner's mind," he said softly as he worked, "is empty like a new cup. It can receive. The expert's mind is so full of what it already knows that nothing can enter. This is why Suzuki teaches us about Shoshin, the beginner's mind. Not because knowledge is bad, but because attachment to knowledge becomes a cage." The scholar sat in silence, watching the master clean up the mess he had caused simply by pouring into a vessel that could hold no more. He noticed, for the first time, how the afternoon light filtered through the paper screens, how the sound of the kettle had changed as the water cooled, how his own breath moved in and out of his body without his directing it. Simple things, immediate things, things that required no knowledge to experience, only presence. "I have been," he said slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth because they were not quotes or citations or explanations, "carrying my knowledge like a merchant carries gold. Everywhere I go, I set it down between myself and the world." Riku finished cleaning and prepared 2 fresh cups of tea, this time pouring just enough to fill each one without waste. He offered one to the scholar, who received it with both hands, suddenly aware of its weight, its warmth, the way the steam rose and dissipated in the air. He had drunk tea 1,000 times, but had he ever truly tasted it? Or had he always been thinking about tea while drinking it, analysing its quality, comparing it to other teas, remembering what he had read about the proper way to appreciate it? He lifted the cup to his lips and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, simply drank tea. Not the idea of tea, not the ceremony of tea, not the spiritual significance of tea, just tea. warm and bitter and alive on his tongue. "The Buddha taught," Rikyu said, watching him drink, "that the mind is everything, that what we think we become. You have been thinking thoughts about awakening, thoughts about Zen, thoughts about enlightenment, and so you have become a man full of thoughts. Perhaps to empty the cup is to stop thinking about the water and simply drink." They sat together in silence as the afternoon light shifted and the shadows grew longer. The scholar felt something releasing in his chest, some tightness he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there. Or his knowledge, or his study, or his understanding it was not wrong perhaps, but it had become a wall instead of a window. He had been so busy learning about reality that he had stopped experiencing it. When he finally stood to leave, bowing deeply this time, truly deeply, the master walked him to the gate. "Your knowledge is not lost," Rikyu said quietly. "But knowledge is like a cup. Sometimes it must be emptied before it can be filled with something new. Sometimes it must be emptied simply to remember what emptiness feels like, that space of pure potential, of openness, of readiness to receive." The scholar walked down the mountain path as evening settled over the valley, and he found himself noticing things he had walked past on his way up the way a spider's web caught the last light. The sound of a stream he had not heard before, the scent of pine and earth and approaching night. His mind, usually so busy cataloguing and interpreting and connecting everything to everything else, was quiet, not empty of thought, but not grasping at thought either. Like a cup rinsed clean, ready to receive whatever might be poured into it. As the scholar leaves with his empty cup, we too might notice what we've been holding too tightly, what we've been grasping, as if permanence were possible in a world where everything flows like water, where everything changes like seasons turning, where nothing remains quite the same from one breath to the next. This brings us to another teaching, another story, one that happened in a different monastery, in a different time, though time itself is just another thing that passes and changes and never stays still. Let me take you now to a mountain monastery known for a single treasure, a bell so ancient that no one could remember when it had first been cast. Some said it had been made 500 years ago by a master craftsman whose name was lost to history. Others claimed it was older still, brought from distant lands across vast oceans. What everyone agreed upon was this: the bell's voice was like no other. When struck at dawn, its deep resonance rolled through the valleys below, a sound so pure and penetrating that farmers in distant fields would pause in their work, and travelers on far roads would stop to listen, and even the birds would fall silent as if in reverence. The bell hung in a wooden frame at the monastery's highest point, where the first light of morning would touch it, and it was the responsibility of the monks to ring it each day at dawn, calling the world to wake with awareness, with presence, with attention to the sacred nature of each new beginning. Among the monks was a young man named Takeshi. He had come to the monastery 3 years earlier, his heart heavy with the grief of loss. His parents had died within a month of each other, and the world that had seemed so solid had revealed itself to be as fragile as rice paper. He sought in the monastery what he could not find in the world below, something permanent, something unchanging, something he could trust not to leave him. And he found it, he believed, in the bell. From the first morning he heard its voice rolling across the mountains. He felt something settle in his chest, some assurance that here was a thing that would endure, while everything else might pass away, while people might die, and seasons might turn, and even mountains might slowly wear down to dust. This bell would remain, its voice unchanging, its presence constant. He began to care for it with a devotion that bordered on worship. Each day, after the dawn ringing, he would climb the wooden stairs to the bell tower and polish the bronze with a soft cloth until it gleamed like a dark mirror. He would check the wooden frame for any sign of weakness, oil the great wheel from which the bell hung, ensure that the striker was properly wrapped in its padding of silk and cotton. The other monks smiled at his dedication, seeing in it a young man's need for something solid to hold on to in a world of impermanence. Master Sogen, the eldest monk, watched Takeshi's devotion with eyes that had seen many young monks come and go, had witnessed many attachments form and dissolve. He said nothing, understanding that some lessons can only be learned through experience, that some truths cannot be taught but must be discovered like hidden springs beneath the earth. The bell became Takeshi's meditation, his practice, his anchor. When his mind wandered during sitting meditation, he would bring it back to the memory of the bell's voice. When he felt the old grief rising in his chest, threatening to overwhelm him, he would go to the bell tower and simply sit near the great bronze vessel, drawing comfort from its solidity, its weight, its presence. He knew every inch of its surface, every subtle variation in the patina, every small mark that centuries had inscribed upon it. He would trace with his fingers the characters carved into its rim, words in an ancient script that he could not read, but had memorized through touch alone. He knew the exact tone it would produce depending on where the striker hit, knew the way its voice changed slightly with the temperature, how on cold mornings it rang more sharply, and on warm, humid days its sound was rounder, fuller, like fruit ripened on the branch. The other monks would sometimes tease him gently. "Takeshi loves the bell more than he loves the Buddha," they would say, and he would smile and not deny it, because in truth the bell had become his Buddha, his teacher, his proof that something in this world of constant change could remain constant. 3 years passed this way, each day beginning with the bell's voice, each day including hours when Takeshi would tend to it, polish it, sit near it, draw from it some quality of peace that he found nowhere else. He had become so skilled at caring for the bronze that it shone more brightly than it had in generations, and visitors to the monastery would often comment on its beauty, not knowing that this beauty was the result of one young monk's desperate need for something permanent to love. Then came the night of the great storm. It arrived without warning, as mountain storms sometimes do, the sky darkening from blue to black in the space of a few breaths. Wind came howling down from the peaks like a wild beast, tearing at the monastery's paper screens, ripping branches from ancient pines, driving rain sideways with such force that it found its way through walls that had stood for centuries. The monks huddled in the main hall, listening to the fury outside, chanting sutras to calm their own minds if not the storm. Takeshi sat with them, but his thoughts were in the bell tower, with the bell exposed to the violence of wind and weather. He imagined the frame shaking, the bell swaying, and he wanted to run out into the storm to protect it, to stand between it and whatever harm might come. Master Sogen, sitting nearby, seemed to read his thoughts. "Sit still," the old monk said quietly, barely audible above the storm's roar. "What will happen will happen. Your worry changes nothing except your own peace." But Takeshi could not sit still, not truly. His body remained motionless, but his mind raced through scenarios of disaster. His heart clenched with fear for the bell's safety. The storm raged for hours, and each crack of thunder, each shriek of wind made him flinch, imagining catastrophe. Finally, near dawn, the storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived. The wind died, the rain stopped, and an eerie calm settled over the mountain. The monks rose and went to survey the damage, finding screens torn, roof tiles scattered, branches and debris everywhere. And Takeshi ran, his robes flapping, his sandals splashing through puddles, ran to the bell tower as the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the retreating clouds. He climbed the stairs with his heart hammering, and when he reached the top, he stopped as if struck. The bell hung at an odd angle, and even in the dim light he could see it, a crack running from the rim upward, a jagged line splitting the bronze like lightning frozen in metal. The wooden frame had twisted in the wind, and the bell had struck hard against one of the support beams, and the impact had broken what he had believed to be unbreakable. He stood staring at it, unable to move, unable to breathe. His legs folded beneath him, and he knelt on the wet wooden floor, and a sound came from his throat that he did not recognize as his own, a wail of grief as deep as when his parents had died, as if the bell were a living thing that had been mortally wounded, as if something essential had been torn fro. The fabric of reality itself. He wept there as the dawn light strengthened. Wept as he had not wept in 3 years, all the grief he had been holding at bay flooding through him. The bell was broken. The one permanent thing he had found in this impermanent world had proven to be as fragile as everything else. There was nothing, nothing at all that could be counted on to stay. He did not hear Master Sogen climb the stairs, did not notice the old monk's presence until a weathered hand rested gently on his shoulder. "Come," the master said. "It is time for the dawn bell." Takeshi looked up, his face wet with tears. "It's broken," he said, his voice raw. "It's ruined. The sound will be wrong, distorted. Everything is ruined." "Perhaps," Master Sogen said. "Shall we see?" With trembling hands, Takeshi took up the striker. He could barely bring himself to do it, to strike the cracked bell, to hear its voice ruined. But the master's eyes were steady, patient, waiting. Takeshi drew back the striker and let it swing forward, bracing himself for discord, for the death rattle of what had been beautiful. The bell rang out, and Takeshi gasped, because the sound was not ruined. It was changed, yes, transformed in ways he could not have imagined. The crack had altered the bell's voice, creating harmonics that had not existed before. Where once there had been a single deep note, now there were two tones interweaving. The original resonance joined by a higher, clearer voice that seemed to rise from the crack itself, like a bird taking flight. The two notes spiraled around each other, creating something new, something unexpected, something that was not worse than what had been before, but simply different, and perhaps, in its own way, even more beautiful for the complexity, for the story the crack told, for the way it had transformed Katast, Rofe, into music. The sound rolled out across the valley as it always had, but now, with this new voice within it, this descant of change singing alongside the bass note of what had been. Takeshi stood listening as the sound faded, and something in him cracked open too, some hard shell of belief that had kept him rigid, kept him afraid, kept him clutching at permanence in a world that was never meant to be held still. Master Sogen spoke softly, quoting the great teacher Dogen. "Impermanence is itself Buddha nature. The very fact that things change is what allows them to teach us, to wake us up, to show us the truth of how things are." Takeshi looked at the crack in the bell, no longer seeing it as damage but as transformation. The bell he had loved was gone, yes, but in its place was a bell that sang a new song, that carried in its voice the story of its breaking and continuing. That was more honest somehow for showing its wound so plainly, for making from that wound something beautiful. "The Buddha taught," Master Sogen continued, his hands still resting on Takeshi's shoulder, "that all conditioned things are impermanent, not as a punishment, not as a tragedy, but as simple truth. Everything that comes together must come apart. Everything that is born must die. Everything whole must eventually break. This is not the problem. The problem is our belief that it should be otherwise, our grasping at permanence in a river that never stops flowing." Takeshi nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in him like the light now spreading across the mountains. "I thought I loved the bell," he said quietly. "But I loved my idea of the bell as something permanent. I loved the safety I felt in believing something could not change. I was trying to use the bell to protect myself from the truth of impermanence." "And now?" the master asked. Takeshi looked at the cracked bell, gleaming in the morning light, and he felt something release in his chest, the same tightness that had been there since his parents died, the same desperate grasping at control, at permanence, at safety in a world where no such safety exists. "Now I love the bell as it is," he said, cracked and changed and still singing. "Still here, but not the same, like everything, like everyone." The master smiled. "The bell is a better teacher broken than it ever was whole. It teaches what it could not teach before. That change is not the end of beauty, but sometimes the beginning of a new kind of beauty. That cracks can create new harmonies, that what we thought was ruined might simply be transformed." They stood together in the bell tower as the sun rose fully above the mountains, and Takeshi understood that the grief he had been running from for 3 years, the grief that had driven him to seek something unchanging to hold on to, was itself a form of love. Love for what had been, love that, Ono, read what was gone by feeling its absence, and that this grief, like the bell's crack, could create its own kind of music if he let it, if he stopped trying to polish it away or hide it or pretend that what changed had never mattered. He polished the bell that morning as he always did, but differently now. He cleaned around the crack carefully, respectfully, not trying to hide it, but honoring it as part of the bell's story, part of its journey through time. The crack gleamed along with the rest of the bronze, and he thought it looked like a river of light running through the metal, like the bell had broken open just enough to let more light out. The sound of that bell still echoes through the mountains, they say, reminding anyone who hears it that nothing stays the same, and yet nothing is truly lost. Every ending contains a beginning. Every crack lets new light through. Every change is an invitation to love what is rather than to grieve for what was, to meet each moment as it actually is rather than as we wish it to be. And Takeshi learned to love impermanence itself, learned to bow to change as to a wise teacher, learned that the heart that can hold loss can hold anything, can remain open even in a world where everything eventually breaks, where every bell eventually cracks, where nothing remains except the truth, that everything passes, everything transforms, everything continues in new forms that we could never have predicted or planned. In this moment between stories, we rest in that same truth, noticing perhaps where we too have been polishing something, trying to keep it perfect, trying to stop it from changing. What if the crack is not the end? What if the breaking open is how the new light gets in? The sound of that bell still echoes through mountains, reminding us that nothing stays, and yet nothing is truly lost. Each ending births a beginning we could not have imagined. Each transformation teaches what permanence never could. And this leads us to another truth, another teaching, one that unfolds beside water, where a man learns that the tightest grip holds nothing, while open hands can contain the whole world. Let me take you now to a small fishing village on the coast, where the sea meets the land in an eternal conversation of waves and shore, where fishermen have cast their nets for so many generations that the rhythms of tide and catch have become woven into their very bones. Here lived a man named Kenji, a fisherman like his father and his father's father, a man whose hands were rough with rope and salt, whose eyes could read the water the way scholars read sutras, who knew the sea in all its moods and seasons. Kenji was not a wealthy man by the standards of those who lived in cities, but he had enough. A small house, a sturdy boat, nets that he mended each evening by lamplight. He had a wife who loved him, 2 children who filled his home with laughter, and the respect of the other fishermen who knew him as steady and skilled, someone who understood that the sea gives what it gives and takes what it takes, and that a fisherman's wisdom lies in accepting both with equal grace. Or so they thought. But Kenji carried within him a hunger that even he did not fully recognize, a desire not just to catch fish, but to catch the greatest fish, to be known not just as a good fisherman, but as the best fisherman, to possess something that would mark him as exceptional. This hunger lived quietly in him, like a pilot light that never quite goes out, and he fed it with fantasies of the legendary catch that would one day be his, the fish so large and magnificent that songs would be sung about it, that his grandchildren's grandchildren would speak of it with awe. He had heard the stories, as all fishermen had, of the great silver fish that sometimes appeared in the deep waters beyond the bay. Some said it was as long as a man is tall, others claimed it was larger still, with scales that caught the light like polished mirrors, with a strength that could break any line, with a wisdom in its ancient eyes that suggested it had been swimming these waters since before the village existed. Many had hooked it over the years, or claimed to have hooked it, but none had ever landed it. It had become less a fish than a legend, less a creature than a dream that swam through the collective imagination of every fisherman who cast a line into those waters. Kenji did not speak of this fish to others, but he thought of it often, especially on days when his catch was ordinary, when he pulled up nets full of common fish that would sell for common prices at the market. He would imagine the weight of that legendary fish on his line, the fight it would give, the moment when he would finally pull it over the gunwale of his boat and claim it as his own. In these daydreams, he could see the faces of the other fishermen, their expressions of wonder and envy. He could hear his own name spoken with a new kind of respect. He could feel the satisfaction of having caught what no one else could catch, of possessing what could not be possessed. Then came the day, late in summer, when the water was the deep blue of cobalt glaze, when the sun hung low and golden over the western horizon. Kenji had gone out alone, farther than usual, following an intuition he could not name, a pull in his chest like a compass needle seeking true north. The other boats had turned back an hour earlier, heading for the harbour and the evening meal, but Kenji rowed on, drawn by something he could not explain and did not question. He cast his line in waters so deep, the bottom was darkness itself, and he waited as fishermen have always waited, with that particular patience that is not quite patience but rather a kind of alert stillness, a readiness to respond when the moment comes. The sun sank lower, painting the water with gold and rose and violet. A heron flew overhead, its wings catching the light. The world was achingly beautiful in that way that late summer evenings can be, when everything seems touched with a quality of precious transience. Then the line went taut, not with the sudden strike of an ordinary fish, but with a weight and a purpose that made Kenji's heart leap into his throat. This was no common catch. He knew it immediately, the way you know certain truths without needing proof, the way you recognize a face you've seen only in dreams. The fish, the great silver fish of legend, had taken his hook. What followed was a battle that seemed to exist outside of time. The fish ran deep, stripping line from the reel with a strength that spoke of wildness uncontained, of freedom that would not be easily surrendered. Kenji braced himself, his muscles straining, his hands burning where the line cut into them, his entire being focused on this single contest of wills. The fish dove and surfaced, and each time Kenji caught a glimpse of it, his breath stopped. It was everything the stories had promised, and more impossibly large, impossibly beautiful, its scales flashing silver and blue and green depending on how the light struck them, its body a perfect expression of power and grace. For an hour, perhaps more, they fought this ancient battle, fisherman and fish, each testing the other, each refusing to yield. Kenji's arms screamed with fatigue, his back ached, sweat ran into his eyes despite the cool evening air. But he would not let go, would not surrender, would not lose this moment that he had dreamed of for so long. Slowly, gradually, he began to win. The fish's runs became shorter, its struggles less violent. He was bringing it in, actually bringing in the legendary fish that no one had ever landed. And then it was beside the boat, so close he could have touched it. This magnificent creature that had lived its life in freedom, that had outsmarted every fisherman who had ever sought it. In the dying light, it rolled on its side, and Kenji found himself looking directly into its eye, large and dark and unfathomable, reflecting the sunset and the sky and his own face looking down. In that eye, he saw something that struck him more deeply than any teaching he had ever received in the small temple in the village, more profoundly than any words any master had ever spoken. He saw the fish's wildness, yes, its strength and its beauty, but he also saw its exhaustion, the toll the battle had taken, the way it hung now barely moving in the water. And he saw, reflected in that dark eye, his own face twisted with an expression he did not recognize. Hunger and greed and a grasping desire that suddenly looked ugly to him, small and mean and diminished. He had imagined this moment so many times, but he had always imagined the triumph, the pride, the possession. He had never imagined this, the actual presence of the fish, the reality of its labored breathing, the weight of choosing what would happen next. In his daydreams, the story ended with the catch. He had never thought beyond that moment to what came after, to the fish dying in his boat, to the magnificent thing reduced to meat and trophy, to the aliveness extinguished so that he could possess a dead thing and call it victory. His hands moved before his mind had fully decided, reaching down to carefully remove the hook from the fish's mouth. The fish hung still, either too exhausted to flee or perhaps sensing, in whatever way fish sense such things, that something had changed in the man holding it. Kenji looked at it for a long moment. This creature he had dreamed of catching, this fish that represented everything he had wanted to prove about himself, everything he had wanted to possess. And then he let go, simply let go, opened his hands and released the fish back into the water and watched it hang there for a moment, suspended between his world and its own, before it seemed to gather itself, seemed to remember what it was, and with a powerful stroke of its tail, dove deep, the silver of its scales catching the last, light as it descended into darkness, becoming smaller and smaller until it was gone, as if it had never been there at all except in the space between dream and memory. Kenji sat in his boat as night fell around him, feeling something vast and strange moving in his chest. His arms ached, his hands bore the cuts and burns of the line. He had caught the greatest fish of his life, the fish every fisherman in the village had dreamed of catching, and he had let it go. He owned nothing from this encounter except the memory, and yet he felt wealthier than he had ever felt, richer than if his boat were filled with silver. An old man sat on the dock when Kenji finally rowed back to the harbour under the stars. His name was Daichi, a retired fisherman who spent his days mending other people's nets and watching the younger generation chase the same dreams he had once chased. He saw something in Kenji's face, some quality of light or openness that had not been there that morning. "You saw it," Daichi said. Not a question, but a statement. "The great silver one." Kenji nodded, tying off his boat, his movements slow with exhaustion. "Did you land it?" the old man asked. "I had it beside the boat," Kenji said quietly. "I looked into its eye, and then I let it go." He expected what? Mockery, perhaps. Disbelief. Some indication that he had made a terrible mistake, had thrown away the opportunity of a lifetime. Instead, the old man smiled, a smile that seemed to contain sadness and joy in equal measure. "Then you caught something better than a fish," Daichi said. "You caught understanding." They sat together in the darkness, the old fisherman and the younger one, and Daichi told him something he had never told anyone else. "I hooked that fish once," he said. 40 years ago. I fought it for 2 hours, got it right to the boat, just like you, and I pulled it in, killed it, took it to market, and sold it for more money than I had ever made from a single catch." He paused, looking out at the dark water. "And I have regretted it every day since. Not because the money wasn't good, but because something died in me when that fish died. Some part of myself that knew the difference between having and being, between possessing and experiencing, between grasping and receiving." He turned to look at Kenji, his old eyes bright in the starlight. "The Buddha taught that the root of suffering is attachment, is grasping, is trying to hold on to what cannot be held. We think we want the fish, but what we really want is the feeling we believe the fish will give us the pride, the recognition, the proof that we are somebody special. But these things cannot be caught and kept. They slip through our fingers like water." Kenji thought of the fish descending into darkness, free, alive, swimming even now through the deep waters of the bay. He thought of how it would have looked dead in his boat. Glorious still perhaps, but diminished, reduced from the living mystery it had been to a thing that could be weighed and measured and sold. He thought of how different he felt now, having let it go, than he would have felt if he had kept it. "I could possess it for one meal," he said slowly, the understanding forming even as he spoke it, "or I can cherish this moment forever." "Yes," the old man said simply, "you understand. The fish you released swims in your memory more vibrantly than any dead fish could hang on your wall. The victory you surrendered is more complete than any victory you could have claimed. You gave the fish its life, and in return, it gave you freedom from the hunger to possess, from the need to prove, from the burden of grasping." They sat in companionable silence, and Kenji felt something settling in him that he had not known was unsettled, some restlessness quieting that he had carried for so long he had stopped noticing it. He thought of his wife waiting at home, his children asleep in their beds. The simple goodness of his life that he had sometimes thought was not enough, was too ordinary, was lacking some essential quality that would make it worthy, make him worthy. But he saw now that the hunger for more, for better, for exceptional, had been keeping him from fully inhabiting what was already his, like the scholar with his full cup, like the young monk clutching at the perfect bell. He had been so focused on what he didn't have, on what he wanted to catch and keep and possess, that he had missed the richness of what was already present. The next morning, when the other fishermen asked about his expedition, he simply said he had gone out farther than usual and caught nothing worth keeping. Some seemed to sense there was more to the story, but he did not elaborate. The truth was not something that could be spoken easily, not something that would make sense to anyone who had not looked into that fish's eye, had not felt the weight of choosing between possession and release. But he carried that truth with him, carried it in the way he cast his nets from that day forward, still skillfully, still with full attention, but without the grasping quality that had once driven him. He caught fish to feed his family, to make his living, to practice his craft with as much excellence as he could bring to it. But he no longer needed to catch the greatest fish. He no longer needed to prove anything or possess anything exceptional. He had learned what Hakuin meant when he taught that the truth is not far away, that we seek it in distant waters when it is right here, in the simple presence of this moment, this breath, this life as it actually is rather than as we imagine it should be. He had learned what the Buddha meant about the suffering that comes from clinging, from the desperate attempt to hold on to what must inevitably slip away. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and he sat watching the sunset paint the water with impossible colors, he would think of that fish, imagine it swimming free in the depths, and feel a joy more complete than any pride of possession could have given him. He had held something precious, and by opening his hands, he had kept it forever. He had lost nothing and gained everything. He had discovered that the open hand holds more than the closed fist, that love without grasping is the only love that lasts, that the greatest wealth is wanting what you already have. Like that fisherman, we rest easier when we open our hands rather than make fists, when we meet each moment with palms open to receive rather than fingers clenched to grasp. And perhaps the deepest opening comes not from trying to change what is, but from meeting reality exactly as it presents itself, allowing things to be as they already are. This brings us to a garden where perfection was endlessly pursued but never found, until the day a storm revealed what had been perfect all along. Let me take you now to the grounds of a temple where lived a woman named Ayame, whose name meant iris, and whose life had become consumed by an impossible task, the creation of perfect beauty in a world where perfection does not exist. She was the temple's gardener, responsible for maintaining the Zen garden that lay at the center of the compound, a space of raked gravel and carefully placed stones that was meant to be an aid to meditation, a landscape of emptiness that could quiet the mind and open the heart to what lies beyond the and ought. The garden was not large, perhaps 20 feet square, bordered by a low wall of weathered wood. According to tradition, it contained 15 stones of varying sizes, arranged in gravel that was raked each day into patterns suggesting water, flow, the eternal movement of existence. Monks would sit on the wooden veranda overlooking the garden, gazing at it during meditation, allowing its simplicity to settle their busy minds, its emptiness to reveal what fullness actually means. Ayame had tended this garden for 7 years, and in those 7 years she had never been satisfied. Each morning before dawn, she would rise and go to the garden, and she would study the arrangement of stones with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Were they positioned correctly? Did they suggest the proper relationship between elements? Did they create the right balance of tension and harmony? And always, the answer was no. Something was slightly off. Some subtle disharmony that only she could perceive, some failure of the arrangement to embody the perfect expression of form arising from emptiness. So she would move them, just slightly perhaps, an inch to the left, a rotation of a few degrees. She had moved the largest stone, which weighed more than she did, 17 times over the years, enlisting the help of other monks, directing them with precise gestures. Her eyes narrowed in concentration, seeking the exact placement that would finally satisfy her vision of how things should be. The other monks watched her efforts with a mixture of admiration and concern. Her dedication was remarkable, her aesthetic sense refined and educated. She could speak eloquently about the principles of Zen garden design, about Ma, the concept of negative space, about the way stones should relate to each other like notes in a musical composition, about how the raking of gravel could suggest the flow of water around islands, the movement of time, its elf, the patterns underlying all existence. But Master Hiroshi, the temple's abbot, saw something else in her ceaseless rearranging. He saw a mind that could not rest, a heart that believed peace lay just beyond the next adjustment, a person who had confused the map with the territory, who thought that arranging stones in perfect harmony would create harmony in her own turbulent mind. He had lived long enough to understand that it works the other way around, that the inner state creates the outer perception, not the reverse. But he also knew that some truths cannot be taught, only discovered. Ayame had come to the temple after a life of striving that had left her exhausted and disillusioned. She had been a designer in the city, creating spaces for wealthy clients who were never satisfied, who always wanted more, wanted different, wanted better. She had arranged and rearranged their possessions, their furniture, their lives, until she no longer knew what she herself wanted, what she herself valued. Everything had become about meeting others' expectations, about creating perfection for people who could not recognize it, who would not know peace if it sat down beside them and held their hand. So she had come to the temple, seeking simplicity, seeking a life pared down to essentials, seeking perhaps some core of truth that had been buried under the accumulation of wants and shoulds and comparisons that had characterized her former life. And she had found the garden, and in the garden she had found a new kind of perfection to pursue, a new way to believe that if she could just get the arrangement right, everything else would fall into place. She studied the classical gardens of Kyoto, learning the principles by which they had been designed. She read treatises on aesthetics, on the relationship between form and emptiness, on how to create stillness through arrangement. She practiced the raking of gravel until she could create patterns of such delicate precision that they seemed to have been drawn by wind itself. And yet, satisfaction eluded her. Each new arrangement of stones seemed promising at first, but within days, sometimes within hours, she would see the flaw, the slight imbalance, the way it was almost right but not quite, and she would begin planning the next rearrangement. The other monks would sometimes sit with her, trying gently to suggest that perhaps the garden was fine as it was, that perhaps the seeking of perfection was itself the obstacle to peace. But Ayame would shake her head, explaining in careful detail what was wrong with the current arrangement, what principle was being violated, what adjustment would finally bring everything into proper relationship. She spoke with such authority, such clear articulation of aesthetic theory, that the monks would often fall silent, unable to argue with her logic, even as they sensed something fundamentally misguided in her approach. The present moment is the only time over which we have dominion, Master Hiroshi would sometimes say, quoting Thich Nhat Hanh, but gently, without insistence, letting the words settle like leaves on still water. Ayame would nod, understanding the concept intellectually, but unable to apply it to her own ceaseless planning of the next adjustment, the next rearrangement, the future moment when the garden would finally be right. Then came the autumn of the great storm, a typhoon that roared up from the south with winds that bent trees double, and rain that fell in sheets so thick you could not see your hand held at arm's length. The monks secured the temple buildings as best they could, bringing in everything that might blow away, reinforcing screens and shutters, preparing to wait out nature's fury in the solid stone meditation hall at the temple's heart. Ayame's last thought before taking shelter was of the garden, of the arrangement she had finally, just 3 days earlier, created 15 stones positioned according to principles she had spent months studying, each one placed with such care that she had felt, for the first time in years, a moment of something like satisfaction. It was not perfect, not yet, but it was closer than she had ever come, and now the storm was going to destroy it. She wanted to go to the garden, to somehow protect it, though she knew this was foolish. What could she do against winds that were tearing branches from trees 100 years old? How could she shield stones that weighed hundreds of pounds? But the desire to control, to preserve, to keep things as she had arranged them was so strong in her that Master Hiroshi had to physically place himself between her and the door, his old eyes kind but firm. "Let the storm teach what I cannot," he said simply. The typhoon raged through the night and into the next day. The monks sat in meditation or chanted sutras, filling the air with sound that could not compete with the wind's howling, but created nonetheless a pocket of human intentionality, a reminder that even in chaos there could be centering, could be presence, could be the choice to remain calm in the mid-saint of turbulence. Ayame sat but could not meditate. Her mind was in the garden, imagining the devastation, seeing in her mind's eye the carefully placed stones scattered, the precise arrangements destroyed, 7 years of work undone in a single night. She felt grief rising in her chest like floodwater, felt anger at the unfairness of it, felt despair at the thought of starting over, of trying once again to create what the universe seemed determined to prevent. When the storm finally passed and they emerged into air-washed clean and light that seemed almost aggressive in its brightness after the darkness of the storm, Ayame walked slowly toward the garden, dreading what she would find. Branches littered the paths. Roof tiles lay shattered on the ground. The ancient cherry tree in the courtyard had lost a major limb. Destruction was everywhere, and she braced herself for the destruction she would find in the space she had tended so carefully. She turned the corner, stepped up onto the veranda, and looked down at the garden, and stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, because what she saw made no sense given what she had been expecting, given what she thought she knew about how the world worked. The storm had indeed rearranged the stones. The winds had been strong enough, or perhaps water had pooled beneath some of them, undermining their positions, or perhaps the shaking of the earth itself had shifted them. They were no longer where she had placed them. The pattern she had so carefully created was gone, destroyed, just as she had feared. But what had replaced it stopped her heart. The stones now rested in positions she never would have chosen, arranged by wind and water and chance into a composition that was, she could not deny it, more beautiful than anything she had ever created. There was an asymmetry to it that felt alive, a sense of movement frozen in stillness, a rightness that she had been pursuing for 7 years but never achieved. It was as if the universe itself had designed the garden, and the universe, it turned out, was a far better designer than she had ever been. She stood staring at it, and something broke open in her chest, some hard shell of belief that had kept her rigid, kept her striving, kept her convinced that her constant intervention was necessary, that without her control things would fall into chaos. The storm had proven otherwise. The storm had shown her that there was an intelligence in randomness, a pattern in chaos, a perfection in what simply is rather than in what she thought should be. Master Hiroshi came to stand beside her on the veranda, and they looked at the garden together in silence. Finally he spoke, his voice soft. The Buddha taught that we should not dwell in the past or dream of the future, but concentrate the mind on the present moment. You have spent 7 years dwelling in a future where the garden would finally be perfect, and now the present moment has given you what the future never could. Ayame felt tears on her face, though she had not been aware she was crying. I never saw it, she said. All these years I was looking at what was wrong, what needed to be fixed, what should be different. I never actually saw what was here. You saw with the eyes of judgment, the master said, comparing what is to some idea of what should be. But what is has no idea of should. It simply is, in all its suchness, in all its tathata. The stones were always perfect. Only your mind demanded otherwise. She thought of all the hours she had spent studying, planning, moving stones by inches, seeking some external arrangement that would finally create internal peace. She thought of how exhausting it had been, how the pursuit of perfection had become its own kind of suffering, how she had traded one form of striving for another, left the city only to bring the city's mindset with her. Acceptance of what is, the master continued, is not passive. It is not giving up or not caring. It is seeing clearly, without the veil of judgment, without the filter of how we think things should be. When we can meet reality as it actually is, we find that it contains everything we were seeking. The peace you wanted to create through perfect arrangement was always available in accepting imperfect arrangement. The harmony you tried to impose was always present in what simply is. Ayame sat down on the veranda, her legs suddenly weak, and she looked at the garden with new eyes, or perhaps old eyes. Eyes that saw without judging, that perceived without comparing, that received what was offered without demanding it be different. The stones rested in their storm-given positions, and they were beautiful, not because they conformed to principles of design, but because they existed, because they were here, because they had their own nature that required nothing from her except acknowledgement. Over the following days, monks would come to look at the garden, and many would comment on how beautiful it was, how the new arrangement seemed even more effective at quieting the mind than previous arrangements had been. They would ask Ayame if she had redesigned it, and she would smile and say no. The typhoon had designed it. She had merely accepted the design, and she made a vow to herself, there on the veranda with Master Hiroshi beside her, and the impossible beauty of the storm-arranged garden before her. She would not move the stones again. She would tend the garden, yes. She would rake the gravel and remove fallen leaves and care for the space with attention and devotion. But she would not try to improve on what the storm had created. She would practice acceptance instead of adjustment, presence instead of planning, receiving instead of rearranging. It was harder than she expected. Old habits of mind die slowly, and for weeks she would catch herself studying the stones, planning how she might move this one slightly, rotate that one a few degrees. The urge to control was deep in her, woven into the fabric of how she had learned to move through the world. But each time the urge arose, she would remember the morning after the storm, the shock of recognition that something beyond her control had created something beyond her capacity, and she would choose instead to simply look, to be present to what was without needing it to be different. Gradually, something shifted in her. The garden became not a project to perfect, but a teacher to learn from. Each morning when she raked the gravel, she practiced accepting the pattern that emerged rather than forcing some predetermined design. Some days the patterns were graceful, flowing like water. Other days they were awkward, uneven, marked by her own distraction or fatigue. And she learned to accept these too, to see that the imperfect pattern raked on a difficult day was as valid, as real, as worthy as the elegant pattern created on a day when everything flowed easily. She began to see the garden as a mirror of her own mind. When her mind was calm, the garden seemed calm. When her mind was agitated, seeking, grasping, the garden seemed to reflect this back to her. But she learned that the garden itself had not changed only her perception of it, only the lens through which she was viewing it. The stones simply were. The gravel simply was. Only her mind created the story of perfect or imperfect, right or wrong, good enough or not good enough. And as she stopped trying to perfect the garden, she found the peace she had been seeking through perfection. As she practiced accepting what was, she discovered the harmony she had been trying to impose. The garden had been teaching this all along, but she had been too busy rearranging it to listen. Master Hiroshi, watching her transformation, thought of Dogen's teaching that impermanence is itself Buddha nature, that the very fact of change is not something to resist, but something to embrace as the fundamental truth of existence. The garden would continue to change, leaves would fall, weather would shift stones, time would work its inevitable transformations, and Ayame was learning to dance with this change rather than fight against it, to see it not as destruction of what she had created, but as the ongoing creation of what is. As we observe this garden settling into stillness, as we see these storm-arranged stones resting in their unplanned perfection, we might notice where we too have been rearranging what already rests in perfect balance. What if we stopped trying to fix what isn't broken? What if we met this moment exactly as it is, with all its imperfections and asymmetries and unexpected beauty? What if we, like Ayame, discovered that the peace we seek through endless adjustment is already present in acceptance of what simply is? That moon still shines tonight, not in books or words, but there, in the space between thoughts. And this brings us to a story about the difference between knowing about something and truly seeing it, between understanding in the mind and understanding in the marrow of your bones. Between the description of water and the taste of water on your tongue, let me take you to another monastery, this one perched on the edge of a cliff where eagles nested and clouds sometimes drifted through the meditation hall like uninvited guests. Here lived a master named Teshin, a woman who had spent 40 years in practice and whose presence had a quality of stillness that seemed to quiet everything around her, the way a deep pool quiets the rushing stream that feeds it. To this monastery came a young student named Hiroshi, and he arrived carrying more than the simple traveling pack on his back. He carried questions, hundreds of them, thousands of them, questions that had multiplied in his mind like bamboo shoots after rain, questions about the nature of enlightenment, about the path to awakening, about consciousness and reality, and the self and emptiness and dependent origination and every concept he had encountered in the years he had spent studying Buddhist philosophy. Hiroshi was brilliant. Everyone who knew him said so. He had studied at the finest schools, had read every important text, could recite sutras from memory and debate their finer points with scholars twice his age. His mind was like a finely crafted instrument, capable of making distinctions so subtle that most people could not even perceive them. He could explain the Mahayana concept of emptiness in relation to the Theravada teaching of no self. He could trace the historical development of Zen from Bodhidharma through the Tang dynasty masters. He could analyze koans, parse their linguistic structures, understand their philosophical implications. But something troubled him, something he could not quite name. Despite all his knowledge, despite his ability to discourse brilliantly on enlightenment, he did not feel enlightened. Despite understanding intellectually that attachment causes suffering, he still suffered. Despite knowing that the self is an illusion, he still felt deeply identified with his thoughts, his achievements, his identity as a brilliant scholar of Buddhism. The gap between his knowledge and his experience haunted him like a shadow he could not outrun. He hoped that Master Teshin could give him the missing piece, the final teaching that would transform his intellectual understanding into direct realization, that would close the gap between what he knew in his head and what he lived in his heart. On his first evening at the monastery, after the other students had gone to sleep, he found the master sitting in the garden, simply sitting in the darkness, doing nothing that he could see. He approached and bowed deeply, and she gestured for him to sit beside her on the stone bench. "Master," he began, and the words tumbled out of him like water breaking through a dam. "I have studied the Dharma for 10 years. I understand the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. I can explain the principle of dependent origination, how all phenomena arise in dependence upon causes and conditions, how nothing possesses inherent existence. I know that attachment is suffering, that the self is empty, that nirvana and samsara are not separate. I understand all of this intellectually, but I don't feel it. I don't live it. How do I move from understanding to realization? What practice do I need? What meditation technique? What method will transform knowledge into wisdom?" Master Teshin sat in silence for so long that Hiroshi began to wonder if she had heard him, or if perhaps his question had been so foolish that it did not merit a response. Finally, she raised one hand and pointed upward, toward the night sky where a full moon hung like a paper lantern, so bright it cast shadows, so luminous that the garden seemed to exist in a kind of dreamlight, neither day nor night, but something in between. "Do you see the moon?" she asked. Hiroshi looked up at it, uncertain what she meant. Of course he saw the moon. "Yes, master," he said. "I see it." "Tell me about the moon," she said quietly. And here, finally, was something Hiroshi could do well. He began to speak, his voice gaining confidence as he moved into familiar territory. "The moon is Earth's only natural satellite," he began. "It orbits our planet at an average distance of 238,085 miles, completing one revolution every 27.3 days. What we perceive as moonlight is actually reflected sunlight. The moon possesses no light of its own, but only reflects the light of the sun. The various phases we observe are the result of the changing angle between the Earth, Moon, and Sun, creating the appearance of the moon waxing and waning. though of course the moon itself remains constant. He continued explaining the moon's gravitational effects on Earth's tides, its role in stabilizing the Earth's axial tilt, the various cultural and religious significances humanity had assigned to it across different civilizations. He spoke about the symbolism of the moon in Buddhist teaching, how it represented enlightenment in some traditions, how the full moon was considered auspicious, how the Buddha was said to have been born, achieved enlightenment, and died on full moon days. He talked about the famous Zen saying, "the finger pointing at the moon," and how Huaining taught that truth has nothing to do with words, that words are like a finger pointing at the moon's location, but the finger is not the moon. The teaching, he explained with some excitement, is that we become so focused on the teachings themselves, on the concepts and the words, that we miss what they're pointing toward, just as someone might study the finger pointing at the moon rather than looking at the moon itself. It's a teaching about the difference between conceptual understanding and direct experience, between map and territory, between... "Stop," Master Teshin said softly. Hiroshi stopped mid-sentence, uncertain. The master was still pointing at the moon, her arm extended, her finger aimed at that luminous disk hanging in the darkness. "You are doing exactly what Huaining warned against," she said, and there was no reproach in her voice, only a kind of gentle sadness. "I point at the moon, and you analyze my finger. You tell me about the finger's position, its symbolic meaning, its historical significance in Zen teaching. You explain what the finger represents and what it's trying to indicate. But all this time, you have not actually looked at the moon." Hiroshi started to respond, to explain that of course he had looked at the moon, that he had been looking at it the whole time he was speaking. But the words died on his lips because he realized, with a shock that went through him like cold water, that she was right. He had been looking at the moon. Yes, his eyes had registered it, his visual cortex had processed the information, but he had not really seen it. He had been too busy thinking about it, analyzing it, connecting it to everything he knew about moons and Buddhist teachings and astronomical phenomena. He had been seeing his own knowledge about the moon rather than the moon itself, the actual moon, the immediate, direct, unmediated presence of that bright disk in the dark sky had been hidden from him by his own cleverness, obscured by the very knowledge that he thought would help him see more clearly. "Look again," the master said quietly, lowering her hand. "But this time, just look. Don't think about what you're seeing. Don't analyze it or explain it or connect it to anything you know. Don't even call it moon. Simply see what is there." Hiroshi looked up, and this time he tried to silence the constant commentary in his mind. The automatic process of naming and categorizing and relating everything to everything else he knew. It was harder than he expected. His mind wanted to think about what he was seeing, wanted to describe it, wanted to fit it into frameworks of understanding. But he kept bringing his attention back to the simple act of seeing, of receiving the light that traveled across space to enter his eyes. And slowly, gradually, something shifted. The moon was no longer an object he was observing, no longer a thing separate from himself that he was analyzing from a distance. It became simply light and dark, brightness and shadow, a presence in the field of his awareness that required no commentary, no explanation, no understanding, beyond the direct experience of seeing itself. The usual sense of himself as a subject observing an object dissolved, and there was only seeing, only the moon appearing in awareness, the way a reflection appears in still water. In that moment, he understood what all his years of study had been unable to teach him. This was what the sutras pointed toward, what the masters spoke of, what meditation aimed to reveal. Not a special state or a mystical experience, but simply this: direct contact with reality, unmediated by the constant filtering and interpreting and conceptualizing that the mind does. Just this, just the moon, seen without the layer of thoughts about the moon. Tears sprang to his eyes, though he could not have said exactly why. Perhaps because it was so simple, so obvious, so immediately available, and yet he had spent years searching for it in books and concepts and elaborate philosophical systems. Perhaps because he saw how his own brilliance had become a barrier, how his capacity for analysis had separated him from direct experience. how his knowledge had become a kind of blindness. The Buddha had taught, believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense. But Hiroshi saw now that he had been believing everything he read, not as blind faith, but as intellectual understanding that he mistook for realization. He had been collecting beliefs and concepts and explanations like a merchant collects gold, thinking that accumulation was the path, thinking that knowing more would eventually transform into being more. "Do you see?" Master Teshin asked, and the question carried layers of meaning. "I see," Hiroshi said, and he meant it in a way he had never meant it before. "The finger pointing at the moon," the master continued, "is a teaching about all teachings, including this one. Every sutra, every dharma talk, every meditation instruction, these are all fingers pointing. They can point you in the right direction, but they cannot give you what they point toward. You must look for yourself. You must see for yourself. No amount of understanding what the finger means, no amount of studying the finger's position or history or significance can substitute for the simple act of turning your head and looking at what it points toward." Hiroshi nodded slowly. He thought of all the texts he had read, all the lectures he had attended, all the debates he had participated in. They had value, perhaps had helped him in ways he could recognize, but they had also become a substitute for direct experience, a way of relating to reality from a safe distance, mediated by concepts and analysis. He had been studying descriptions of water while dying of thirst, studying maps of mountains while never leaving the valley, studying accounts of awakening while remaining deeply asleep. "But Master," he said, and now there was a different quality to his voice, less certainty and more genuine inquiry. "How do I cultivate this direct seeing? How do I practice it? What meditation technique develops this capacity?" The master smiled, and there was kindness in her smile, but also something that might have been amusement. "You're doing it again," she said gently. "Even now, even after what you just experienced, your mind wants to turn this into a concept, a technique, a practice that you can study and perfect and achieve. You want a finger that points at the practice of seeing without fingers." Hiroshi laughed despite himself, seeing the absurdity of it, the way his mind automatically reached for the familiar comfort of method and technique, turning even the insight into non-conceptual seeing, into a concept to be grasped and understood. "The practice," Master Teshin said, "is simply this. Notice when you are relating to life through the filter of your thoughts about life, rather than through direct experience. Notice when you are seeing your concepts rather than what is actually present. Notice when you are studying the finger rather than looking at the moon. And when you notice, gently return to direct experience. Again and again, as many times as necessary. This is the practice, not complicated, not esoteric, not special. Just this." They sat together in silence, and Hiroshi found that the silence was different now, deeper somehow, more spacious. Before, his silences had always been full of thoughts, full of himself thinking about, not thinking, analyzing his own experience even as it happened. But now there was a quality of genuine quiet, of resting in simple presence without the constant need to understand or explain or achieve. The moon moved slowly across the sky as they sat, and Hiroshi watched it without thinking about watching it, received its light without analyzing the reception. Sometimes thoughts arose, observations, connections, bits of knowledge surfacing. But now he could see them as thoughts, as movements in the mind, rather than as the truth about what he was experiencing. The moon was the moon. His thoughts about the moon were thoughts, and he could choose, moment by moment, whether to be lost in the thoughts or present with the moon. Thich Nhat Hanh taught, Master Teshin said softly after a long silence, that the present moment is the only time over which we have dominion, not the past which is gone, not the future which hasn't arrived, but this moment, right now, right here. And yet we spend so much of our time living in our thoughts about past and future, in our concepts and ideas and analyses, that we miss the only moment we actually have. Hiroshi understood now in a way he had not understood before when he had read those same words in books and nodded in intellectual agreement. The present moment was not a concept or a philosophical position. It was this: moonlight on stone, cool air on skin, the sound of wind in pine trees, the feel of breath moving in and out of the body. Nothing mystical, nothing special, just the ordinary miracle of direct experience, available in every moment if he could stop obscuring it with his own mental commentary. He thought of the young monk who had polished the bell, trying to keep it perfect and unchanging. He thought of the fisherman who had released the great fish, discovering that open hands hold more than grasping fists. He thought of the scholar with his overflowing cup, too full of his own knowledge to receive anything new. And he saw that he had been like all of them, trying to possess understanding the way one possesses an object, trying to grasp enlightenment the way one grasps a fish, trying to keep his knowledge perfect and unchanging, like a bell that would never crack. But understanding, real understanding, could not be possessed. It could only be lived, moment by moment, in the direct encounter with what is actually present, rather than with ideas about what is present. "Thank you, Master," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked. "For pointing at the moon." "The moon was always there," she said. "I only reminded you to look up." They sat together as the moon traced its arc across the sky, and Hiroshi felt something fundamental shifting in him, some deep reorientation of his entire way of being. He had spent years accumulating knowledge, and that knowledge had value perhaps. But now he understood that wisdom was not the accumulation of knowledge, but the capacity to see clearly, to experience directly, to meet each moment as it actually is, rather than through the filter of what we think we know about it. The gap between his understanding and his experience began to close, not because he had gained some new knowledge, but because he had stopped trying to live through knowledge alone and had begun to live through direct presence. The moon shone. The wind moved through the trees, his breath came and went, and in the simple acknowledgement of these obvious facts, without elaboration or analysis, there was a completeness that all his years of study had never provided. That moon still shines tonight, not in books or words or concepts or explanations, but there in the actual sky, available to anyone who looks up, anyone who stops studying the finger long enough to see what it points toward. We need not understand the moon to receive its light. We need not analyze the present moment to inhabit it. We need only look, only see, only rest in the simple presence of what is already here. And so we find ourselves arriving at the final teaching, the one that circles back to where we began. For the deepest truths are not linear paths to distant destinations, but spirals that return us again and again to the same essential insights, each time with deeper understanding, each time with more, a capacity to actually live what we have always, in some sense, known. Let me take you now to a small coastal village where the mountains meet the sea, where fishing boats rest on black sand beaches and salt spray seasons, the air. In this village lived an old woman named Keiko, whose days had settled into a rhythm as reliable as the tides rising before dawn to tend her small garden, sweeping the path to her door, preparing simple meals, sitting in meditation, and in the evenings offering tea to anyone who came to visit her. Simple wooden house perched on the hillside overlooking the water. Keiko had once been a renowned teacher, sought after by students from across the country who wanted to learn from her deep understanding of Dharma. She had taught at monasteries and retreat centers, had given talks that drew hundreds of people, had written commentaries on sacred texts that were studied by scholars, but that was long ago, and she had left that life behind, returning to this village where she had been born, living out her final years in quietude and simplicity. She was not entirely alone, however. Living with her was her granddaughter Yuki, a girl of 17 whose parents had died when she was young and who had been raised by Keiko in this house by the sea. Yuki was bright and curious, full of questions about everything, impatient with the slowness of village life, dreaming of the city and the larger world beyond the mountains. She loved her grandmother, but she could not understand her, could not understand why someone who had been so important, so respected, so influential, would choose to live like this quietly, simply, doing the same small tasks day after day, growing vegetables, sweeping paths, sitting in stillness. It seemed like such a waste, such a diminishment of a life that had once touched so many people. "Grandmother," she would say, watching Keiko kneel in the garden, pulling weeds with slow, careful attention, "don't you miss it? Don't you miss teaching, miss having students? Miss the sense of purpose and importance you must have felt when people came from everywhere to learn from you?" Keiko would smile and continue her work, running her fingers through the soil, checking the moisture level, adjusting the mulch around a tomato plant. "I still teach," she would say. "I teach the garden how to receive water. I teach the path how to be swept. I teach the teacups how to be cleaned." Yuki would shake her head in frustration. These weren't real answers, just the kind of cryptic Zen sayings that old teachers used when they didn't want to explain themselves clearly. She wanted her grandmother to talk to her like a normal person, to have a real conversation about purpose and meaning and what to do with a life. "But what about all the knowledge you have?" Yuki would press. "All the understanding you've developed over decades of practice. Shouldn't you be sharing it, writing it down, passing it on to students who could benefit from it? Instead, you just sit here, day after day, doing nothing important." "What makes you think I'm doing nothing important?" Keiko asked, genuinely curious. "You're just living," Yuki said, gesturing around at the simple house, the small garden, the quiet routine of their days. "Just existing. Anyone can do that. But you're someone special, someone with wisdom and insight. You should be doing something with it, not just wasting it on ordinary life." Keiko set down her gardening tools and stood slowly, her old knees creaking with the effort. She walked to where Yuki sat on the porch steps and settled beside her, looking out at the sea where waves rolled endlessly toward the shore. The same waves that had rolled toward this shore for millions of years before they were born, and would roll for millions of years after they were gone. "Tell me, Yuki," she said gently, "what do you think wisdom is for?" Yuki considered this. "To help people," she said finally. "To teach them, guide them, help them understand how to live better, how to suffer less, how to find peace and meaning." "And how do you think wisdom does this helping?" "Through teaching, through sharing knowledge, through explaining the Dharma to people who don't understand it yet." Keiko nodded slowly. "I used to think that too," she said. "For many years I thought that wisdom was something I possessed, something I had accumulated through study and practice, and that my purpose was to transfer this wisdom to others, to give them what I had, to fill their cups with what had filled mine." "And that's wrong?" Yuki asked, confused. "Not wrong," Keiko said, "just incomplete. Because wisdom isn't really something you possess, something you can package up and hand to someone else like a gift. Wisdom is more like..." She paused, searching for the right words. "Wisdom is like the ocean. I can tell you about the ocean. I can describe its depth and salt, and the way light moves through water. I can explain the science of tides and currents. I can recite poetry about the sea's vastness. But none of that is the same as you walking into the water yourself, feeling it on your skin, tasting the salt, experiencing directly what ocean actually is." Yuki was quiet, listening despite her skepticism. "For many years," Keiko continued, "I taught people about the ocean. I was very good at it. I could describe it beautifully, could help people understand its nature, could point them toward it and encourage them to experience it for themselves. But I began to notice something. The students who truly transformed, who truly found what they were seeking, were not necessarily the ones who understood my teachings best. Often they were the ones who watched me live, who saw how I walked, how I spoke, how I responded to difficulty, how I met each moment. They learned more from watching me sweep a floor than from hearing me explain emptiness." "I don't understand," Yuki said. "I know," Keiko said with affection. "You're 17. How could you understand? But let me try to explain it this way. The Buddha taught that we should be a lamp unto ourselves. Not that we should learn how lamps work, or study the theory of light, or memorize teachings about illumination, but that we should actually be light. Actually illuminate our corner of the world through how we live, not through what we say about how to live." She gestured toward the garden. When I pull weeds, I pull weeds. My whole attention is there, with that plant, that soil, that moment. I'm not thinking about pulling weeds or planning the next task or wishing I were doing something more important. I'm just fully present with the pulling of weeds. And in that complete presence, that total attention to this moment exactly as it is, there is a teaching, not a teaching in words, but a teaching in being. Someone watching me might see this presence, might feel it, might be touched by it in ways that no explanation could achieve. But that seems so small, Yuki protested, so limited. When you were a famous teacher, thousands of people heard your words. Now, maybe 1 or 2 people might see you in your garden. How is that better? Keiko smiled. Thich Nhat Hanh taught that there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. Do you understand what that means? Yuki shook her head. It means we cannot find peace in the future by striving and achieving and doing important things in the present. Peace, real peace, is available only now, only in this moment, only in how we meet whatever is actually in front of us. For years, I taught people this truth. I explained it eloquently. I helped them understand it intellectually. But I wonder now if I was really embodying it. I was teaching peace while living in a state of constant activity, constant striving to reach more people, help more students, write more books, give more talks. I was teaching presence while living in future-oriented achievement. She stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the sea. Then my daughter, your mother, died, and something in me broke open. All my wisdom, all my understanding, all my teaching ability could not prevent that suffering, could not make sense of that loss, could not fill the hole her absence left in the world. And I realized that I had been teaching about wisdom without fully living it. I had been pointing at the moon without looking at it myself. Yuki felt tears rising in her eyes at the mention of her mother, whom she barely remembered, but whose absence was a constant ache in her heart. So I came back here, Keiko continued, to this village, to this simple life, to live what I had been teaching, not to abandon teaching, but to deepen it, to actually practice presence instead of just explaining it, to actually embody peace instead of just describing it, to actually be a lamp instead of just giving lectures about illumination. But grandmother, Yuki said, her voice thick with emotion, what about me? What about the wisdom you could give me? You keep saying these mysterious things about gardens and lamps and presence, but you never just tell me clearly how should I live my life? What should I do with myself? What is the right path for me? Keiko returned to sit beside her granddaughter, and she took the girl's hands in her own weathered ones. My dear child, she said softly, that is exactly the question I cannot answer for you. And any teacher who claims to have the answer to that question for someone else is a false teacher. I can tell you how I have lived, what I have learned, what practices have helped me, but your life is your own. Your path is yours to discover. The deepest wisdom I can offer you is this. Be present with your own life. Pay attention to what is actually happening, not to what you think should be happening, or what you fear might happen, or what you hope will happen. Be here, now, with what is. But that's not enough, Yuki said, frustrated. I need guidance, direction, answers. No, Keiko said gently but firmly. You think you need those things, but what you actually need is to learn to trust your own direct experience, your own inner knowing. You need to learn to be present with uncertainty, with not knowing, with the discomfort of having to figure things out for yourself. This is how wisdom develops, not through receiving answers from others, but through learning to be fully present with your own questions. She released Yuki's hands and stood again. Come, she said, let me show you something. She led Yuki down the path from the house to the beach, where the evening tide was coming in, waves rolling up the black sand and sliding back, rolling and sliding in endless rhythm. They stood at the water's edge, and Keiko pointed out to sea where the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Do you see how each wave is unique? She asked. How each one rises and falls in its own way, follows its own path to the shore. And yet each wave is also part of the ocean, inseparable from the whole, arising from the same source? Yuki nodded. watching the waves. Your life is like that, Keiko said. Unique, individual, following its own particular path, but also part of something larger, connected to all other lives, arising from the same source. When I was teaching in the monasteries, I was trying to tell people how to be good waves, what shape to take, what path to follow, how to crash upon the shore. But I have learned something in these quiet years. Waves don't need to be told how to be waves. They need only to be fully what they are, to follow their own nature, to move with the ocean's movement rather than against it. She turned to face her granddaughter. You want me to tell you how to live your life, what path to take, what choices to make, but I cannot do that without robbing you of the very thing that will make your life meaningful, the discovery of your own path, the development of your own wisdom, the experience of your own unique wave rising and falling and returning to the ocean. So you won't help me? Yuki asked, and there was hurt in her voice. I am helping you, Keiko said. I am helping you by not giving you answers that would only be my answers, by not imposing my path on your journey, by not filling your cup so full of my wisdom that there is no room for your own to develop. I am helping you by living my life as fully and presently as I can, by being a lamp in my corner of the world, by showing you through how I live, that peace is available right here, right now, in the simple act of being fully present with whatever is. They stood together in silence, watching the waves, and gradually Yuki felt something shifting in her. Her frustration was still there, her desire for clear answers, her impatience with her grandmother's cryptic wisdom, but underneath it she could feel something else emerging, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, the old woman was pointing at something real, something important, something that could not be captured in direct answers or clear instructions. The Buddha also taught, Keiko said softly, that we should not believe something just because a teacher says it, or because it's written in sacred texts, or because it sounds wise. We should only believe what we can verify through our own direct experience. This is the teaching I give you now. Don't believe what I tell you. Test it, live it, see for yourself if presence brings peace, if acceptance brings freedom, if being fully here now with what is brings more fulfillment than constantly reaching for what might be. Yuki thought about this, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. But how do I test it? She asked. How do I practice this presence you talk about? You already are, Keiko said, and there was warmth in her voice. Right now, standing here, watching the sunset, feeling the sand beneath your feet, hearing the waves, breathing the salt air, this is presence, this is practice. Not something special or mystical or difficult, just this. Just being fully here with what actually is. They stood together as the sun touched the horizon, and Keiko felt a deep gratitude for this moment, for this girl beside her, for this life that had brought her full circle from seeking wisdom to teaching wisdom to finally, simply living it. She thought of all the students she had taught over the years, all the words she had spoken, all the texts she had written. Had any of it helped anyone? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But she knew with certainty that this moment, this simple presence with her granddaughter watching the sun set over the sea, this was teaching of a different order, not teaching about life, but teaching through living, not pointing at truth, but embodying it. I love you, grandmother, Yuki said quietly. I love you too, my dear child, Keiko replied. And the best way I can show that love is not to give you all the answers, but to trust you to find your own way, to discover your own wisdom, to become your own lamp in the darkness. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. They turned and walked back up the path to the house, where Keiko would prepare their simple dinner, where they would eat together in comfortable silence, where they would sit in meditation before sleep, where life would continue in its ordinary, miraculous way, each moment complete in itself, each small action a teaching, each breath a practice, each day an opportunity to be fully present with what is. And perhaps this is the deepest teaching of all, that wisdom is not something we achieve and then possess, not something we accumulate and then distribute to others, but something we embody in each moment, in each action, In each encounter with the world as it actually is, we become lamps, not by learning about light, but by being light, by living with such presence and attention and care that our very way of being in the world becomes a teaching for anyone who has eyes to see it. The stories come full circle. The bell that cracked revealed perfection in imperfection. The fish released showed freedom in letting go. The cup that overflowed taught emptiness through fullness. The garden storm arranged demonstrated peace in acceptance. The moon-pointing finger illuminated seeing beyond concepts. And now this grandmother on a hillside, teaching through living, shows us that the path is not separate from the destination, that presence is not practice for some future peace, but peace itself, available now, here, in this very moment, if we can simply stop striving long enough to receive it. We have walked through gardens that taught acceptance, sat beneath moons that revealed the difference between knowing and seeing, watched as fishermen discovered that open hands hold more than closed fists. Each story has pointed toward the same truth from a different angle, like fingers pointing at the same moon from different positions. And now we come to a story about return, about the journey that circles back to where it began, only to find that the beginning has been transformed by the journey itself. Let me take you to a small village nestled in a valley where the mountains rose on three sides like the walls of a natural temple, and where a river ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from peaks that remained white even in summer. In this village lived a young woman named Keiko, and like so many seekers before her, she felt a restlessness that the ordinary life of the village could not satisfy, a hunger for something she could not name, a sense that there must be more to existence than the simple round of days she saw unfolding before her. She worked in her family's rice fields, helped her mother prepare meals, joined the seasonal festivals, greeted neighbors on the narrow village paths. From the outside, her life appeared no different from any other young woman's life in that place and time. But inside, Keiko felt like a bird that had somehow sensed the existence of sky beyond the familiar trees, like a fish that had caught a glimpse of ocean beyond the boundaries of its pond. The village was beautiful in its way. The mountains changed color with the seasons, green with summer growth, gold and crimson in autumn, stark white in winter, soft with spring blossoms. The rice fields formed geometric patterns that shifted from bare earth to bright green to golden yellow as the crop progressed through its cycle. Children played in the streets. Old people sat in doorways watching the world go by. Life moved in rhythms established over centuries, reliable as the seasons, predictable as the turning of water wheels in the stream. But Keiko wanted enlightenment. She had heard stories from a traveling monk who had passed through the village, stories about masters who had awakened to the true nature of reality, who lived in a state of permanent peace and clarity, who had transcended the suffering and confusion that seemed to characterize ordinary human existence. She had heard about temples where these masters taught, places where one could dedicate oneself entirely to the pursuit of awakening, free from the distractions and obligations of mundane life. The monk had spoken of a famous teacher who lived in a monastery on a distant mountain, a master known for the clarity of his teaching and the depth of his realization. Students came from across the country to study with him, the monk said, and many had achieved profound insights under his guidance. The monastery was strict, the training rigorous, but for those truly committed to awakening, it offered a direct path to the liberation Keiko yearned for. So one spring morning, when the cherry blossoms were falling like snow and the rice fields were being prepared for planting, Keiko left. She told her parents she needed to do this, though she could not fully explain why. They did not understand. They saw no reason to leave a good life in search of something that might not exist. But they saw the determination in her eyes and knew that to prevent her would only embitter her, would make her blame them for a life she had not chosen. So they blessed her with heavy hearts and watched her walk down the mountain path toward the wider world beyond their valley. The journey to the monastery took 3 months. Keiko walked through landscapes she had never imagined, saw cities where more people lived than she had known existed, crossed mountains that made her home valley seem like a small wrinkle in the earth's surface. She slept in wayside shrines, accepted the hospitality of strangers, worked for meals at inns and tea houses, and always she kept moving toward her destination, toward the monastery where she believed she would finally find what she was seeking. When she arrived, dirty and exhausted and wearing shoes that were more whole than leather, the monastery gate seemed impossibly large, impossibly solid, a barrier between the world of confusion she was leaving and the world of clarity she hoped to enter. She knocked, and after a long wait, a monk opened a small window in the gate and peered out at her. "I have come to study with the master," Keiko said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I seek enlightenment." The monk studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. "The path is difficult," he said. "Many who enter these gates leave again within weeks, some within days. Are you prepared to give up everything you think you know, everything you think you are?" "Yes," Keiko said without hesitation. The gate opened and she entered. The training was indeed rigorous. She woke before dawn to sit in meditation, her legs cramping, her back aching, her mind racing with thoughts she could not quiet. She worked in the gardens, scrubbed floors, prepared meals, all while maintaining mindful awareness of each action, each breath, each arising of thought or emotion. She studied sutras, listened to Dharma talks, engaged in ritual practices whose meaning she did not fully understand but performed with diligent precision. And gradually, over months that became years, something shifted. Her mind, which had been like a pot of boiling water, began to settle. She learned to watch thoughts arise and pass without being caught by them, learned to rest in simple presence without always needing to be somewhere else, to be someone else, to be doing something else. She had moments of clarity, glimpses of what the teacher spoke of, brief openings into a way of being that was spacious and peaceful and complete. The master taught in the tradition of sudden enlightenment, the idea that awakening comes not gradually, but in a flash of recognition, a sudden seeing through of illusion to the reality that had always been present but obscured. "You are already Buddha nature," he would say. "You are already what you seek to become. The only problem is that you don't recognize it." Practice is not about acquiring something new, but about removing the obscurations that prevent you from seeing what you already are. Keiko listened to these teachings, understood them intellectually, even had experiences that seemed to confirm them. But something troubled her, something she could not quite articulate. She had left her village in search of enlightenment, and she had found teachings and practices and a community dedicated to awakening. She had changed in profound ways, had developed capacities of awareness and presence that her younger self could not have imagined. And yet, the fundamental seeking that had driven her from her home had not ceased. It had merely become more refined, more subtle. But it was still there, the sense that true awakening lay just beyond her current level of understanding. That one more retreat, one more insight, one more breakthrough would finally deliver the permanent peace she sought. She had been at the monastery for 7 years when the letter arrived. Her father had died. Her mother was alone, managing the rice farm with the help of neighbors. But she was old and growing frail. Would Keiko come home, at least for a visit? Keiko's first response was resistance. She had given up that life, had committed herself to the path of awakening. To return, even temporarily, felt like a step backward, a retreat from the progress she had made. She went to the master for guidance. He read the letter and looked at her with eyes that seemed to see everything she was trying to hide from herself. "What are you afraid of?" he asked. The question struck her like a physical blow. She realized she was afraid that if she left the monastery, even briefly, she would lose what she had gained. She was afraid that the ordinary life of the village would pull her back into unconsciousness, would erase the years of practice, would prove that all her effort had been in vain. She was afraid that enlightenment was something that could only be maintained in the protected environment of the monastery, that it would evaporate the moment she stepped back into the messy complexity of ordinary life. "If your awakening cannot survive planting rice," the master said gently, "then it is not awakening, but only a pleasant mental state dependent on particular conditions." The Buddha did not teach a peace that requires withdrawal from life, but a peace that can be lived in the midst of life. Go to your mother. Take care of what needs to be taken care of, and see what happens to your practice when it meets the world it originally fled from. So Keiko returned to the village, and the journey back took not 3 months but 3 weeks, for she had money now and could travel by train and bus for much of the distance, walking only the final stretch through the mountains to her home valley. She arrived in early autumn, when the rice was golden in the fields and ready for harvest, and the mountains blazed with the colors of turning leaves. The village looked exactly the same, as if she had left yesterday rather than 7 years ago. The same houses stood in the same places. The same old people sat in the same doorways. The same children, well, not the same children, but children who looked exactly like the ones she remembered, played the same games in the same narrow streets. It was as if time had stopped in her absence, as if the village existed in some pocket outside the flow of change that had so transformed her during her years away. Her mother wept when she saw her, and Keiko felt something crack in her chest, some protective armor she had built around her heart during her years of rigorous practice. She held her mother, the small woman who had carried her, raised her, worried about her through all the years of her absence, and she felt the simple human reality of love and loss in a way that all her meditation and study had not quite prepared her for. The next morning she woke before dawn, the habit of the monastery still strong in her, and went out into the rice fields. The harvest needed to be brought in, and there was no one else to do it. So she began to cut the rice, bending and cutting, bending and cutting. The same motion repeated thousands of times, the same motion her ancestors had performed for generations beyond counting. And something extraordinary happened, or perhaps something extraordinary ordinary happened. As she worked, she found herself completely present with the work, not thinking about it, not analyzing it, not comparing it to meditation practice or seeing it as spiritual exercise, but simply cutting rice. The swish of the blade through stalks, the weight of the bundles in her arms, the ache in her back and shoulders, the cool morning air, the sound of birds in the nearby trees. All of it was simply present, simply happening, requiring nothing from her except participation. This was what she had been practicing in the meditation hall, the simple presence with what is actually happening. But in the meditation hall, she had been practicing it as a technique, as a means to an end, as a way to achieve enlightenment. Here, cutting rice, there was no goal, no achievement, no enlightenment to attain. There was only this bend, cut, gather, stand. Bend, cut, gather, stand. The rhythm of work, the rhythm of life, the rhythm of reality, simply being what it is without needing to be anything else. She worked all day, and in the evening she prepared dinner for her mother, washed the dishes, swept the floor. And in each action she found the same simple presence that she had cultivated through years of meditation. But now it was not something she was doing, not a practice she was maintaining, but simply the natural way of being when the mind is not constantly reaching for something beyond the present moment. Over the following weeks, as she helped with the harvest, repaired the house, cared for her mother, something fundamental shifted in Keiko. All those years at the monastery, she had been seeking enlightenment, as if it was something separate from ordinary life, something that could be found only by withdrawing from the world into special practices and rarefied states of consciousness. But now she saw that the teachings had been pointing all along toward the simple completeness of ordinary life, when met with full presence and acceptance. The rice grew and was harvested. The seasons turned. Meals were prepared and eaten. Clothes were washed and mended. Her mother grew older. The mountains changed color with the seasons. And all of it, every mundane detail of it, was the enlightenment she had traveled so far to find. Not a special state, not a mystical experience, not a permanent condition of bliss or clarity, but simply this: life lived with full presence, with acceptance of what is, with open hands and an open heart. She remembered the teaching: before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. She had understood it intellectually at the monastery, but now she understood it in her bones. The activities were the same. What changed was the relationship to them, the end of constantly seeking something beyond them, the end of treating the present moment as an obstacle to some future moment when she would finally be who she was supposed to be. Thich Nhat Hanh had taught that washing the dishes is not something to rush through so you can get to the real business of meditation or spiritual practice. Washing the dishes is the practice, being fully present with the warm water, the slippery plates, the soap bubbles, the simple act of making something dirty clean. This is as profound a meditation as any formal sitting practice, and perhaps more so because it is the meditation of ordinary life, the practice that can be maintained not just in a monastery, but everywhere, always. Keiko stayed in the village, not because she'd given up on awakening, but because she had found it where she had left it 7 years earlier, waiting patiently for her to return and recognize it. The monastery had been necessary, perhaps had given her tools and understanding and a framework for working with her mind. But the awakening itself was not in the monastery. It was here, in the simple village she had once thought too small to contain the truth she sought. She planted rice in the spring and harvested it in the fall. She cared for her mother until the old woman died peacefully in her sleep one winter night, having lived to see her daughter return and settle into the life she had once abandoned. She married a man from the village, had children, watched them grow and eventually have their own questions, their own restlessness, their own seeking. And when her oldest daughter came to her one day and said, "Mother, I feel like there must be more to life than this village, more than planting rice and raising children. I want to seek enlightenment. I want to study with a master and learn the truth about reality." Keiko did not try to stop her. Instead, she blessed her daughter and watched her walk down the mountain path, just as her own parents had watched her leave so many years before. And she smiled, knowing that her daughter would need to make her own journey, would need to seek elsewhere to finally recognize what had been here all along. The journey away was part of the journey home. The seeking was part of the finding. You cannot appreciate the simple completeness of ordinary life until you have exhausted yourself searching for something beyond it. Years later, when her daughter returned with eyes that finally saw what they had been looking at all along, Keiko welcomed her home without speaking of irony or lessons learned. They simply prepared tea together, washed dishes together, worked in the fields together, and in the simple harmony of shared work, of presence with what is, of acceptance of the ordinary miracle of existence, they found what no monastery could give, and no special teaching could transmit the peace that was always here, waiting quietly beneath the noise of seeking, as close as breath, as simple as rice growing in a field. The village still sits in its valley, where mountains rise on 3 sides and a river runs clear and cold. Rice is still planted in spring and harvested in fall. Children still play in the streets. Old people still sit in doorways, watching the world go by. And sometimes, very rarely, someone feels a restlessness, a hunger for something beyond the ordinary round of days. They leave, seeking enlightenment in distant monasteries, in teachings and practices and states of consciousness. And some of them, the fortunate ones, eventually return. They come back to find that nothing has changed, except themselves. They come back to discover that what they sought in the distance was here all along, closer than close, more obvious than obvious, hiding only because they were looking past it towards something they imagined must be more special, more spiritual, more enlightened than the simple reality of life as it actually is. Before enlightenment, plant rice. After enlightenment, plant rice. The rice doesn't care about your enlightenment. It grows the same either way. But the planter learns to be fully present with the growing, fully alive to the simple miracle of seed becoming grain, of effort becoming sustenance, of life endlessly renewing itself in the ordinary activities we once dismissed as obstacles to what we really wanted to be doing. This is the teaching the village has always offered, though few can hear it before they leave. You are already home. You are already whole. You are already what you seek. The only journey necessary is the journey that brings you back to where you already are, seeing it for the first time, with eyes no longer clouded by the belief that somewhere else is better, someone else is wiser, some other moment will finally be the right moment to stop seeking and start living. The Buddha taught that we should not dwell in the past or dream of the future, but concentrate the mind on the present moment. This teaching sounds simple, almost obvious when we hear it, but living it proves more difficult than understanding it. For most of us, the present moment is like a train station, where we briefly pause between memories and plans, between regrets and anxieties, between what was and what might be. We stand on the platform of now, but our attention is somewhere else entirely, and in that elsewhere, we miss the only moment we actually have. Let me take you now to a hospice, a place where people come when their time in this world is measured, not in years, but in days or weeks, where the future has collapsed into something immediate and unavoidable, where the luxury of postponing life until conditions are perfect has been stripped away by the simple fact of mortality. In this hospice worked a nurse named Kenji, a man in his mid-30s who had chosen this difficult work for reasons he could not fully articulate, even to himself. There was something about being present with people at the edge of life that felt more real to him than anything else he had encountered. In the hospice, the usual social performances fell away. People stopped pretending. They stopped maintaining the elaborate facades they had constructed over lifetimes. They became, in their final days, more essentially themselves than they had perhaps been in decades. Kenji had been trained in the technical aspects of hospice care: pain management, symptom control, the physical processes of dying. But he had learned the deeper lessons from the patients themselves, from the hundreds of people he had accompanied to the threshold between life and death. He had learned that most people die the way they lived, that the patterns they had established over a lifetime did not suddenly change in the final days. Those who had spent their lives avoiding difficulty avoided their dying too, retreating into denial or medication-induced oblivion. Those who had lived with presence and acceptance often died the same way, meeting their end with a kind of equanimity that transformed everyone who witnessed it. But there were exceptions, moments when something shifted at the very end. When a person who had lived their entire life postponing joy, postponing connection, postponing the full engagement with existence, would suddenly wake up to the present moment with an intensity that was almost unbearable to Ignis. It was as if the imminence of death had burned away everything extraneous, leaving only what was essential, what was real, what was here and now. One such person was a man named Takeshi, a businessman who arrived at the hospice on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, accompanied by a daughter who visited once, left her contact information, and did not return. Takeshi had spent his life building an empire, working 16-hour days, sacrificing everything: marriage, relationships, health, presence with his children, to the construction of wealth and status. He had been, by the world's standards, extraordinarily successful. He owned properties in 3 countries, had investments that would keep his descendants comfortable for generations, had achieved every goal he had set for himself as a young man starting out in business. And now, at 68, with pancreatic cancer that had been discovered too late and spread too far, none of it mattered. The properties could not help him. The investments could not save him. The empire he had built would continue without him, indifferent to his absence. What remained was a dying man in a hospice bed, alone except for the nurses who attended him, facing the end of a life he was only now beginning to question. When Kenji first met him, Takeshi was furious at his body for betraying him, furious at the doctors who could not cure him, furious at his daughter for her absence, furious at the universe for the unfairness of it all. He had done everything right, he insisted. He had worked hard, played by the rules, built something lasting. Why was this happening to him? What had he done to deserve this? Kenji listened, without trying to argue or explain or make it better. He had learned that anger was part of the process, that people needed to move through it rather than around it. He brought water when Takeshi was thirsty, adjusted pillows when he was uncomfortable, administered medication when pain broke through. He was simply present, reliably there, asking nothing, judging nothing. For the first week, Takeshi lived almost entirely in the past and future. His mind churned constantly over what had happened, decisions he had made, opportunities seized or missed, relationships he had handled one way when he should have handled them another. He replayed conversations from decades ago, refighting old battles, defending choices that no longer needed defending. And when he was not dwelling in the past, he was frantically planning a future that would not arrive. Treatments he would try if he could just get to a different hospital, experimental drugs he had read about, alternative therapies that might somehow reverse the irreversible. He made phone calls, barking orders to business associates, trying to maintain control over the empire even as his body deteriorated. He had his laptop brought to the hospice, spent hours when he should have been resting, reviewing financial reports, answering emails, engaging with the world of business, as if staying connected to it might somehow keep him connected to life. Kenji watched this with a sadness he tried not to show. He had seen it before, this desperate clutching at the life that was slipping away, this refusal to accept what was actually happening. There was nothing wrong with it exactly. People dealt with death in different ways, and who was he to judge? But he also knew, from experience, that this approach tended to create more suffering, that the resistance to what is happening took enormous energy and produced very little peace. One evening, about 10 days after Takeshi's arrival, Kenji came into his room for the evening medication check and found him staring out the window at the garden beyond. The laptop was closed, the phone was silent on the bedside table. Takeshi was simply looking, and there was something different in the quality of his attention, less agitated, more settled. "The maple tree," Takeshi said without turning from the window, "is losing its leaves." Kenji came to stand beside the bed, following Takeshi's gaze. The garden was beautiful in the autumn twilight, the maple tree, an explosion of red and gold, leaves drifting down one by one in the still air, covering the ground beneath in a carpet of color. "Yes," Kenji said simply. "I never noticed before," Takeshi continued, still staring at the tree. "I mean, I knew intellectually that leaves fall in autumn, but I never actually looked at it, never saw it happening. It's," he paused, searching for words, "it's beautiful and sad, but mostly beautiful." They stood in silence, watching the slow drift of leaves, the gradual transformation of the tree from fullness to emptiness. In Zen philosophy, this was called mono no aware, the pathos of things, the gentle sadness that comes from awareness of impermanence. Everything changes, everything passes, nothing lasts. And in that very transience lies a particular kind of beauty, the beauty of the moment that will not come again. "I spent my whole life," Takeshi said quietly, "preparing for a future that never arrived. When I was young, I worked hard so that someday I could relax and enjoy life. But when that day came, I worked harder because there was always more to achieve, more to build, more to protect. I told myself I was doing it for my family, for my children, but they grew up and moved away, and I hardly know them. I told myself I would have time later for the things that mattered, relationships, beauty, presence, but later kept receding, kept being postponed. And now there is no later. There is only this." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and Kenji saw tears on his face, though Takeshi made no move to wipe them away. "When I was first diagnosed," he continued, "my mind immediately went to all the things I hadn't done yet, all the places I hadn't visited, all the experiences I had postponed. I made lists of what I would do when I beat this, when I recovered. Thailand, I thought. I've always wanted to go to Thailand, learn to paint. I've always wanted to learn to paint, reconcile with my daughter, tell her I'm sorry. But I was still living in the future, still planning for a time that wasn't now." He turned from the window to look at Kenji directly. "You know what's strange? Now that I know there is no future, now that I've accepted that this is dying, not a temporary setback before returning to normal life, now I'm actually here for the first time in years. Maybe for the first time ever. The maple tree losing its leaves. The way the light comes through the window in the afternoon. The taste of water. The feeling of breathing. All these ordinary things I never paid attention to because I was always somewhere else, always in my head, always planning, worrying, remembering, analyzing." Kenji pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed. Shnat Han taught that washing dishes can be as profound as formal meditation if we are truly present with it, Not washing dishes while thinking about what we'll do after the dishes, but washing dishes while washing dishes. Most of us spend our lives doing one thing while thinking about another. We eat lunch while planning dinner. We work on one project while worrying about the next. We're never quite here, never quite fully engaged with what's actually happening. Yes, Takeshi said with feeling. Exactly that. My whole life was like that. I was never where I was. Even good moments, moments I should have enjoyed: my daughter's graduation, my son's wedding. I was half present, distracted by work concerns, by what needed to happen next week or next month. I have photographs of these events, but I don't really remember them because I wasn't actually there. My body was there, but I was lost in thought, lost in plans and worries. He looked back at the window, at the maple tree steadily releasing its leaves. But now, he said softly, I don't have the luxury of postponing presents. There is no next week, no next month. There is only now, only this breath, and this one, and this one. And strange as it sounds, there's a kind of relief in that. The future I was always trying to control has dissolved, and what's left is this moment, just this moment, and it's enough. It's more than enough. Over the following days, Kenji watched a transformation in Takeshi that was remarkable in its completeness. The angry, grasping businessman fell away, revealing someone gentler, more open, more present. He stopped making phone calls about business. He asked for the laptop to be taken away. He let go of the empire he had built, acknowledging that it would continue or not continue without his constant intervention, that his attempts to control from a hospice bed were both futile and a waste of the precious little time he had left. Instead, he started paying attention to small things: the way morning light moved across the wall, the sound of rain on the roof, the texture of the blanket against his skin. He would call Kenji over, not because he needed anything, but because he wanted to share some observation. Look how the shadows change. Listen to that bird. Feel how soft this pillow is. His daughter came to visit again, perhaps responding to some change she sensed even over the phone. Their conversation was brief, awkward at first, weighed down by years of absence and unspoken resentments. But Takeshi did not try to explain or justify or defend, did not dwell in the past or make promises about a future that would not arrive. He simply told her he loved her, that he was sorry for not being present when she was growing up, that he saw clearly now what he had missed, and he wanted her to know. She cried, and he cried, and they sat together in silence holding hands, and Kenji, checking on them from the doorway, thought that this moment of genuine presence was worth more than all the money Takeshi had accumulated, all the success he had achieved, all the future moments he had sacrificed. Moment 4. You know the strange thing, Takeshi said to Kenji one afternoon about a week before he died. I'm happier now than I've been in decades, maybe happier than I've ever been. Which makes no sense. I'm dying. I'm in pain that requires constant medication. I've lost everything I spent my life building. But I'm here. I'm actually present in my own life for the first time, and it turns out that being present, even present with dying, even present with pain and loss, is better than the alternative, better than living my whole life in my head, in plans and memories, never quite touching down into reality. He paused, gathering strength to continue. The Buddha taught that we should concentrate the mind on the present moment. I heard that years ago, read it somewhere, understood it intellectually, but I didn't know what it meant. I thought it was just another technique, another method to achieve some future state of peace. I didn't understand that the present moment isn't a means to something else. It's the only thing there is. Everything else, past and future, plans and memories, exists only in thought. The only reality is now, this moment, this breath, this sensation, this experience happening right here. Kenji nodded. And most of us spend our lives, he said gently, treating the present moment like a waiting room for a future that never quite arrives. We're always getting ready to live, preparing to be happy, working towards the day when conditions will be perfect. But conditions are never perfect, and while we wait for them to improve, life is happening. This moment is happening, and we miss it. "I missed decades of moments," Takeshi said, and there was grief in his voice but also acceptance. "I can't get them back. I can't go back and be present at my son's baseball games or really see my daughter on her wedding day. That time is gone. But I have this moment. I have right now. And I'm not going to miss it. However many moments I have left, hundreds or dozens or just a few, I'm going to be here for them." And he was. In his final days, as his body weakened and speech became difficult, Takeshi remained remarkably present. He didn't fight what was happening, didn't rage against the dying of the light. He met each moment as it came difficult, moments with difficulty, peaceful moments with peace, painful moments with acknowledgement of pain, but without the extra layer of suffering that comes from resistance, from wishing it were different. The night he died, Kenji was with him. Takeshi's breathing had become labored, and they both knew the end was close. But there was a calmness in the room, an almost palpable quality of acceptance. Between breaths, Takeshi's eyes were open, looking at nothing in particular, or perhaps at everything, perhaps at the simple fact of existence still available to him in these final moments. "Thank you," he whispered, and Kenji wasn't sure if he was being thanked or if Takeshi was expressing gratitude more generally, to life itself perhaps, for the opportunity to finally be present, even if that presence had come so late. His breathing slowed, each breath a little shallower than the last, and then, between one breath and the next, he was gone. The transition was so subtle that Kenji almost missed it, presence becoming absence, being becoming not being. But there was no struggle in it, no last-minute panic or grasping, just a gentle letting go, a final relaxation into what is. Kenji sat with the body for a while, as was his practice, marking the transition, honoring the life that had been. He thought about all the people he had accompanied this way, all the different approaches to dying he had witnessed, and he thought about what Takeshi had discovered in his final weeks, that the present moment is not something we need to earn or achieve or wait for perfect conditions to experience. It's already here, already available, already complete in itself. The tragedy was not that Takeshi had died. Everyone dies. The tragedy was that he had waited until he was dying to start living, had postponed presence until he had no choice, had treated 6 decades of moments as a preamble to a future that never came. But perhaps it wasn't entirely tragic. Perhaps there was grace in his late awakening, wisdom in his final insights. Perhaps his discovery could serve others, could remind those who still had time not to waste it, not to postpone life until conditions are perfect, not to miss the only moment we ever actually have. As Kenji left the room and walked down the quiet hospice corridor, he felt the floor solid beneath his feet, heard the distant hum of machinery, saw the soft glow of nightlights along the wall. He was here, in this moment, alive and breathing and walking. Tomorrow would come or it wouldn't. The past was gone. But this moment, this step, this breath, this was real, this was available, this was enough. The Buddha taught that we should not dwell in the past or dream of the future, but concentrate the mind on the present moment, not because the present is always pleasant or perfect, but because it's the only moment we have dominion over, the only moment we can actually live in, the only moment that's real. Everything else is memory or imagination, useful perhaps, but not the same as the direct experience of now. That maple tree is still losing its leaves somewhere in some autumn garden, and we can watch them fall, actually watch them, actually be present for the slow transformation of fullness into emptiness, and emptiness into the promise of new growth. We need not wait until we're dying to start living. We need not postpone presence until conditions are perfect. This moment, imperfect as it may be, is the only one we have. What will we do with it? We've walked through gardens where perfection was pursued and found only when pursuit ended, sat beneath moons that could be studied but needed only to be seen, watched fishermen learn that open hands hold more than closed fists, and now our path takes us to a story about the space between breaths, the silence between words, the emptiness that is not absence but the ground from which all presence arises, In a valley where mist gathered in the mornings like thoughts gathering in the mind, there lived a potter named Kenji who created vessels of extraordinary beauty. His bowls and cups and vases were sought after by collectors and tea masters, admired for their elegant forms and subtle glazes, the way they seemed to capture something essential about simplicity and grace. People would travel great distances to acquire his work, would pay sums that embarrassed him, would speak of his pieces as though they were treasures beyond price. But Kenji himself felt like a fraud, not because his work lacked skill. His technical mastery was undeniable, refined through 30 years of practice. Not because he didn't care about his craft. He approached each piece with devotion and attention. The fraudulence he felt was more subtle, more troubling. It was this: despite creating vessels that others found beautiful, despite shaping clay with hands that knew their work, despite all his skill and dedication, he felt that his pots were somehow dishonest, that they missed the essential truth he was trying to express. He would sit at his wheel, centering clay with practiced ease, pulling up walls thin and even, creating forms that seemed to emerge from the earth with inevitability, as though the bowl or cup had always been waiting in the formless clay and he was merely revealing it. And yet, when the piece was finished, when it emerged from the kiln, with its glaze settled into subtle variations of color, when he held it in his hands and examined it with the critical eye of 3 decades of practice, he always felt the same quiet disappointment. Something was missing. Something essential had failed to transfer from his vision to the clay. The problem, he eventually realized, was that he was trying to create fullness, trying to make vessels that were complete and whole and perfectly formed. Each pot was an attempt to capture beauty, to embody elegance, to present perfection. He shaped the clay with the intention of creating something, of adding form to formlessness, of imposing his vision onto raw material. And this, he began to sense, was precisely what made his work feel false. He thought often of the teaching he had encountered in his youth, when he had briefly studied at a Zen monastery before choosing the potter's life. The master there had spoken of emptiness, of quanyata, trying to explain that emptiness in Buddhism does not mean nothingness, but rather the absence of inherent, independent existence. All things, the master taught, are empty of a fixed, separate self. They exist only in relationship, only in dependence on countless causes and conditions, only as temporary gatherings of elements that will eventually disperse. Kenji had understood this intellectually, the way Hiroshi had understood the teachings about the moon. He could explain the concept, could see its logic, could recognize its truth in an abstract way. But he had not understood what it meant for his work, had not seen how it applied to the very act of creation itself. He was still trying to make things that possessed their own existence, their own completed nature, vessels that were full of themselves. One autumn evening, as the light slanted golden through his workshop windows and dust motes drifted in the beams like small worlds suspended in space, Kenji sat looking at his latest creation. A tea bowl of classic proportions, its glaze the color of celadon, its form impeccable. He had spent weeks on it, attending to every detail, refining the shape until it met the exacting standards of the tea ceremony, creating a piece that any master would be honored to use. And it was wrong, not in any way he could point to, not in any technical sense, but it was wrong nonetheless. It was too much, too complete, too finished, too full of its own perfection. It left no room for the tea, no space for the person who would hold it, no emptiness for the ceremony to fill. It was a beautiful object, but it was not an honest vessel. In frustration, Kenji picked up the bowl and held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness of the glaze, the perfect balance. And then, without quite deciding to do it, he threw it against the wall of his workshop. It shattered with a sound like a small cry, pieces scattering across the floor, the perfect form reduced to fragments. He sat in the silence that followed, shocked by his own action, staring at the broken shards. And in looking at them, scattered and incomplete, he saw something he had not seen in any of his finished pieces. The broken bowl, with its jagged edges and exposed raw clay, with its glaze cracked and fragmentary, with its form destroyed and its perfection shattered. This broken bowl was more honest than anything he had created intact. It showed what a pot actually was, not a permanent object, but a temporary gathering of earth and water and fire. Not a complete thing, but a moment in an endless process of forming and dissolving. Not full, but fundamentally empty. The brokenness revealed the truth that wholeness had hidden. Kenji spent that night sitting among the fragments, and something shifted in him, the way tectonic plates shift beneath the Earth's surface, slowly, massively, changing the entire landscape of how he understood his work. He had been trying to create completion, but what if the purpose of a vessel was not to be complete, but to contain incompletion? What if the beauty of a bowl lay not in its finished form, but in its emptiness, in the space it created rather than the clay that created the space? A pot, he realized, is not valuable because of what it is, but because of what it is not. The clay walls are merely the container for the emptiness they surround. When you use a bowl, you use the empty space within it, not the clay itself. When you drink from a cup, your lips touch the rim, but the tea rests in the void. The function of any vessel lies in its emptiness, not its form. The form exists only to give shape to emptiness, to create a particular quality of space, a defined absence that can receive and hold. He thought of the Tao Te Ching, a text he had read years ago and barely remembered. We join spokes together in a wheel, but it is the center hole that makes the wagon move. We shape clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that holds whatever we want. We hammer wood for a house, but it is the inner space that makes it livable. We work with being, but non-being is what we use. All these years he had been working with being, with clay and glaze and form and technique. He had been trying to create things, to make objects of beauty that would stand complete in themselves. But he had been ignoring the non-being, the emptiness that was the actual purpose of everything he made. He had been so focused on the walls of his vessels that he had forgotten about the space within them. This understanding changed everything. Kenji began working differently. He still used the same clay, the same wheel, the same techniques he had refined over decades, but his intention shifted. Instead of trying to create beautiful forms, he tried to create beautiful emptiness. Instead of focusing on the clay, he focused on the space the clay would contain. Instead of making vessels that were complete and perfect, he made vessels that were openly incomplete, that acknowledged their own emptiness, that served not as objects to be admired, but as containers for experience. He began leaving his pots slightly asymmetrical, with walls that varied in thickness, with rims that wavered rather than running perfectly level. He created surfaces that were rough in places, glazes that broke unevenly, forms that seemed almost accidental, as though they had shaped themselves. To the casual observer, his new work might have seemed less skilled, less refined, less perfect than his earlier pieces, but to those who understood, who could see what he was trying to express, the new pots possessed a quality that the old ones had lacked, a kind of honesty, a willingness to show their own incompletion, an acknowledgement of the emptiness at their core. He thought often of wabi-sabi, the Japanese aesthetic that finds beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. He had known about this concept intellectually, had even tried to incorporate it into his earlier work. But now he understood it in a different way. Wabi-sabi was not about making things that looked imperfect while actually being carefully crafted to appear that way. It was about genuinely accepting imperfection, about allowing the work to be what it was without trying to force it into some ideal of what it should be. His new pieces had cracks sometimes, places where the glaze had crawled or the clay had walked slightly in the kiln. Before, he would have discarded such pieces as failures, as flawed objects that didn't meet his standards. Now, he saw these supposed flaws as expressions of the material's own nature, as the clay and fire and glaze having their say in the creative process. The cracks and warps and irregularities were not failures, but collaborations, moments where his intention and the material's nature met and created something neither could have produced alone. People who acquired his new work sometimes didn't know what to make of it. They were accustomed to his earlier pieces, to the perfection of form and glaze that had made his reputation. These new pots seemed rougher, less finished, less obviously beautiful. Some collectors were disappointed, felt they had paid for a master's work, and received something that looked almost crude. But the tea masters understood. They recognized what Kenji was trying to express. When they held one of his new bowls, they felt the emptiness within it, not as absence but as presence, as a quality of receptivity that invited the tea ceremony to unfold within it. The bowls were no longer objects that commanded attention through their own beauty. They were spaces that allowed the ceremony itself to become beautiful, containers that received rather than proclaimed, vessels that served by stepping back rather than by standing forth. One day, a young potter came to study with Kenji, drawn by his reputation but confused by the apparent simplicity of his recent work. "Master," the young man said, "I've seen your earlier pieces, the perfect bowls and elegant vases. They were exquisite. But this new work seems so plain, so unrefined. Have you lost your skill, or is this some new technique I don't understand?" Kenji smiled and picked up one of his recent tea bowls, a simple thing with rough texture and uneven glaze. "Tell me," he said, "what is this bowl?" The young potter examined it carefully. "It's a tea bowl," he said, "made of stoneware clay, fired in reduction, glazed with what appears to be ash glaze with some iron content." "Yes," Kenji said. "And what else?" The student looked again, uncertain what his teacher wanted to hear. "It's a vessel for holding tea." "Look more carefully," Kenji said gently. "What is the most important part of this bowl?" The young man studied it, turning it in his hands, examining the form, the glaze, the foot ring, the rim. "I'm not sure, master. The shape? The glaze?" Kenji took the bowl and held it at eye level so they could both see into it. "The most important part," he said, "is this the emptiness inside. Without this emptiness, the bowl cannot hold tea. Without this space, it cannot serve its purpose. The clay exists only to give shape to this emptiness. The form exists only to define this space. I used to make bowls that were all about the clay, about the form, about my skill in shaping them. Now I try to make bowls that are about the emptiness, about the space that receives." He set the bowl down and looked at his student. "When you make a pot," he continued, "you think you are creating something. You think you are adding form to formless clay, imposing your will on passive material. But actually, you are creating nothing. You are only shaping emptiness, defining space, giving form to what is already there. The clay does not create the pot's usefulness. The emptiness does. Your work as a potter is not to make things, but to reveal emptiness, to create space, to shape receptivity." The young potter sat with this teaching, and Kenji could see him struggling with it, the way Kenji himself had struggled, trying to grasp with the intellect what could only be understood through practice, through the actual experience of working with clay and fire, with this different intention. "Try this," Kenji said. "Tomorrow, when you throw a pot, don't think about the form you're creating. Think about the emptiness you're shaping. Feel your hands defining space rather than building walls. Center the clay, yes, but center it around emptiness. Pull up the walls, yes, but pull them up to contain space. Everything you do, do it for the sake of the emptiness, not the clay." The student tried. It was harder than it sounded. His hands knew how to shape clay, but they did not know how to shape emptiness. His mind knew how to envision a form, but it did not know how to envision space. Again and again he would begin with the intention of creating emptiness and end up simply making pots in his usual way, focused on the form, on the clay, on the thing he was creating, rather than the nothing he was shaping. But slowly, over weeks and months of practice, something began to shift. His pots became less deliberate, less controlled, less perfect. They began to have a quality of openness, of receptivity, of space that invited rather than proclaimed. They were still skillfully made, His hands had not forgotten their craft, but the skill was now in service of emptiness rather than form, space rather than substance. Kenji watched this transformation with satisfaction, recognizing in his student the same journey he himself had made, the same movement from trying to create perfect things to trying to create perfect emptiness, from working with being to working with non-being, from filling to emptying. He thought of Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching that the present moment is the only time over which we have dominion. Each pot was made in a series of present moments: the centering, the opening, the pulling up of walls, the shaping of rim and foot, and each of those moments was itself empty, not a thing but a space, not a possession but a presence. To work with clay in full presence was to work with emptiness in both senses. The emptiness of the moment itself and the emptiness being shaped in the clay. The pots that emerged from this double emptiness, the emptiness of presence and the emptiness of form, had a quality that could not be achieved through skill alone. They were humble, unassuming, honest. They made no claims, sought no admiration, demanded no attention. They simply offered space, offered receptivity, offered the possibility of being filled with tea and ceremony, and the quiet moments of human connection that the tea ceremony existed to create. One evening, as Kenji sat in his workshop surrounded by recent pieces, all of them imperfect, all of them incomplete, all of them openly acknowledging their own emptiness, he felt a peace he had not felt in his earlier years of pursuing perfection. These pots were true. They did not pretend to be more than they were. They did not claim completion. They did not possess. They were honest vessels, containers for emptiness, forms that served by stepping back, clay that knew its purpose was to define space rather than to be admired for itself. He picked up a small cup, one with a crack running down one side, a flaw that had appeared in the firing. Before, he would have thrown it away. Now, he saw the crack as an acknowledgement of impermanence, a reminder that all forms are temporary, that everything that comes together will eventually come apart. The crack made the cup more honest, more true to the nature of existence itself. It would still hold tea, it would still serve its purpose, but it would do so while openly showing its own fragility, its own incompleteness, its own eventual return to formlessness. This, he thought, was what his work had been trying to express all along, even when he didn't know it. Not the beauty of perfect form, but the beauty of emptiness acknowledged. Not the creation of things, but the shaping of space. Not the pursuit of completion, but the honest acceptance of incompletion. The void at the center of each vessel was not a lack, but the very source of its value. Not an absence, but the deepest kind of presence. The presence of receptivity, of possibility, of space for life to unfold. And sitting there in his workshop, surrounded by his imperfect, incomplete, openly empty vessels, Kenji finally felt that his work was honest, that it expressed the truth he had been seeking, that it served the purpose for which clay and fire and human hands exist, not to create permanent things, but to shape temporary spaces. Not to fill the world, but to create places for emptiness to rest, not to proclaim, but to receive. The pots sat in silence, offering nothing, claiming nothing, simply holding space, simply being empty, simply serving through their willingness to contain what came to fill them. And in their emptiness, they were complete. The tea still steeps in those cups, the rice still grows in those fields, the maple leaves still fall in that hospice garden. And all of these stories circle back to the same essential truth, approached from different angles, expressed through different lives, but always pointing toward the same moon. The recognition that peace is not found by grasping but by releasing, not by adding but by subtracting, not by becoming something more but by accepting what already is. Let me take you now to a monastery high in the mountains, where the air was thin and clear, and the silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. This monastery was known throughout the region as a place of serious practice, where monks dedicated themselves to zazen with an intensity that bordered on ferocity, sitting in meditation for hours each day. pursuing enlightenment with the same single-minded focus that warriors once pursued victory in battle. Among these monks was a man named Daichi, who had come to the monastery 15 years earlier with a burning desire to awaken, to break through delusion, to achieve the enlightenment that all the texts promised and all the masters seemed to possess. He had been a scholar before becoming a monk, had studied Buddhism academically, had written papers on the nature of consciousness and the phenomenology of meditation states. He understood the Dharma intellectually in ways that most monks never would, could explain the subtleties of different schools of thought, could trace the historical development of Buddhist philosophy through its various transformations. But understanding, he knew, was not the same as realization. Knowing about enlightenment was not the same as being enlightened. And so he had left his academic career and entered the monastery, determined to transform his intellectual knowledge into direct experience, to move from the map to the territory, from words about truth to truth itself. For 15 years he had practiced with unwavering dedication. He sat zazen for 8 hours each day, maintained mindfulness during work periods, attended every Dharma talk, participated in every session, the intensive meditation retreats where monks would sit from before dawn until late at night, day after day, pushing through pain and exhaustion in pursuit of breakthrough. He had studied with the monastery's roshi, had worked through koans, had experienced states of profound concentration and moments of what seemed like insight. And yet, despite all this effort, despite 15 years of devoted practice, despite his intelligence and dedication and understanding, Daichi felt no closer to enlightenment than when he had begun. If anything, he felt further away. The more he practiced, the more he seemed to solidify the very sense of self he was trying to transcend. The more he sought awakening, the more he reinforced the seeker who was doing the seeking. He had created what one of his teachers called the prison of practice, a subtle trap where the very effort to become enlightened becomes the obstacle to enlightenment. He knew this intellectually, of course. He had read the texts that warned about this trap, had heard teachers explain that enlightenment cannot be achieved through effort, because effort implies a self trying to achieve something, and the recognition of no self is precisely what enlightenment reveals. He understood that seeking enlightenment reinforces the illusion of a separate self who needs to become enlightened. He knew all of this. But knowing did not free him from the trap. His practice had become a kind of career, a project of self-improvement, a pursuit of spiritual achievement. He kept careful track of his progress, noting in a journal the quality of his meditation sessions, the insights that arose, the obstacles he encountered. He compared himself to other monks, felt competitive about who sat longer, who maintained better posture, who seemed to have deeper understanding. The monastery that was supposed to free him from self-concern had become a place where self-concern took on a spiritual disguise. The monastery's abbot, a woman named Soen, had been watching Daichi for years with a mixture of compassion and concern. She recognized in him a pattern she had seen many times before, the pattern of someone trying so hard to wake up that the very effort kept them asleep, someone grasping so tightly at freedom that they could not see they were already free. She had tried various approaches with him over the years, had given him different koans, had assigned him various work practices, had spoken to him in both gentle and sharp ways about the nature of his predicament. Nothing had worked. Daichi would nod, would understand intellectually what she was pointing toward, would apply himself with even more effort to trying not to try so hard. The trap had many layers, each one more subtle than the last, and he was caught in all of them. One spring morning, after the early meditation session, Soen called Daichi to her quarters. He came expecting another teaching, another koan, another technique or practice that might finally produce the breakthrough he had been seeking for so long. Instead, she did something unexpected. "I'm sending you away," she said simply. Daichi felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath him. "Master, I don't understand. Have I done something wrong? Have I failed in my practice?" "Your practice is impeccable," Soen said. "That's precisely the problem. I'm sending you to work in the village, at the hospital there. You will serve as an assistant to the nurses, helping care for the sick and dying. You will live in the staff quarters. You will not do formal meditation practice. You will not study sutras. You will not work on koans. You will simply work at the hospital, doing whatever needs to be done. But Master, Daichi protested, how will this help my practice? How will it lead to awakening? Soen smiled, and there was both kindness and firmness in her expression. 15 years you have been trying to awaken. 15 years of intensive practice. And where has it gotten you? Your problem is not that you practice too little, but that you practice too much. Your problem is not that you don't understand the Dharma, but that you understand it too well. You have turned the path into a project, enlightenment into a goal, practice into a career. You need to stop practicing and start living. I don't understand, Daichi said, and the confusion in his voice was genuine. I know you don't, Soen said gently, and that's exactly why you need to go. When you stop trying to understand, when you stop trying to achieve, when you stop trying to become enlightened, then perhaps you will discover what has been here all along. Enlightenment is not something you achieve through effort. It's what remains when effort ceases, when seeking ends, when the self that wants to become enlightened is seen through and released. So Daichi went to the village, to the small hospital that served the surrounding mountain communities. He moved into a simple room in the staff quarters, put away his meditation robes, and began the work of caring for the sick. At first, he felt lost, disconnected from everything that had given his life meaning and structure. The hospital was chaotic compared to the monastery's ordered routine. There were emergencies at all hours, patients who cried out in pain, families who grieved, staff who worked too many hours, and sometimes grew short-tempered from exhaustion. There was no time for formal meditation, no space for spiritual practice as he had understood it. There was only the immediate demand of what needed to be done, helping a patient to the bathroom, changing soiled sheets, bringing water, sitting with someone who was frightened and alone. The work was unglamorous, often unpleasant, occasionally heartbreaking. Nothing like the dignified pursuit of enlightenment he had imagined during his years at the monastery. For the first few weeks, part of his mind kept trying to turn this into practice, to see it as another spiritual technique, to maintain mindfulness while helping patients, and thereby continue his pursuit of awakening in a different form. But the work was too demanding, too immediate, too real to be turned into an exercise. When someone was crying in pain, there was no time to be mindful about it in a formal way. There was only the immediate response, getting medication, adjusting their position, holding their hand, being present with their suffering without trying to fix it or transcend it or use it for spiritual development. Gradually, something began to shift in Daichi. So subtle at first, he didn't notice it. The constant background hum of self-evaluation that had characterized his monastery years began to quiet. He stopped thinking about whether he was being mindful enough, whether his practice was progressing, whether he was getting closer to enlightenment. There was simply the work, the patience, the immediate demands of each moment. When he was helping someone walk down the hallway, he was just walking, just supporting them, just there. When he was washing dishes in the hospital kitchen, he was just washing dishes, feeling the warm water, the slippery soap, the smooth surface of plates becoming clean. It was not that he had become perfectly mindful or achieved some special state. It was simpler than that. He had stopped trying to be anywhere other than where he was, stopped trying to be anyone other than who he was, stopped treating each moment as a stepping stone to some future moment when he would finally be enlightened. One evening, about 3 months into his time at the hospital, Daichi was sitting with a dying man named Tanaka, an elderly farmer who had worked the mountain fields all his life and now lay in a hospital bed with lungs that were slowly filling with fluid, each breath a little harder than the last. Tanaka was not afraid. He had lived a long life, had done his work, had raised his family, and now he was ready to go. They sat together in comfortable silence, and Daichi found himself simply present, not trying to be present, not maintaining mindfulness as a practice, but just naturally there with this old man in this room at this moment. There was nothing special about it, nothing particularly spiritual or profound. Just two people sitting together, one dying and one alive, both breathing, both existing in this moment that would never come again. "You're a monk, aren't you?" Tanaka said suddenly, his voice rough and thin. Daichi was surprised. He was wearing ordinary clothes, had not mentioned his background. "How did you know?" Tanaka smiled faintly. "Something about how you sit, how you're just here, not fidgeting, not thinking about being somewhere else. Most people can't do that. They visit, but they're not really here. They're thinking about what they'll do after, or worrying about what to say, or uncomfortable with dying and wishing they were anywhere else, but you're just here." Daichi felt something crack open in his chest. He had spent 15 years in intensive practice trying to be present, trying to achieve the state of just being here that this dying farmer recognized in him now, when he had stopped trying, when he had given up the pursuit of enlightenment and was simply doing what the moment required. "I was a monk," he said quietly. "I'm not sure what I am now." "You're here," Tanaka said simply. "That's what you are, here, now, with me. Nothing else matters, does it?" And in that moment, Daichi saw with perfect clarity what Soen had been trying to show him, what 15 years of practice had been pointing toward, what all the teachings had been attempting to express. This was it. This was the enlightenment he had been seeking. Not some special state or mystical experience or permanent condition of bliss, but simply this: being fully present with what is, without the constant overlay of judgment and seeking and self-evaluation that he had been calling spiritual practice. The Buddhist teaching of anatta, of no self, suddenly made sense in a way it never had before. It wasn't that there was no self in some philosophical sense that needed to be understood intellectually. It was that when you were truly present, when you were fully here with what was happening, the sense of a separate self trying to get somewhere, trying to achieve something, trying to become enlightened, that sense simply dissolved. Not because you had destroyed it through effort, but because you had stopped feeding it with constant seeking and striving and self-concern. Tears came to his eyes, though he couldn't have said if they were tears of joy or grief or simply release. "Thank you," he said to Tanaka, though he wasn't sure the old man could even hear him anymore, wasn't sure what he was thanking him for. Tanaka died that night, quietly, between one breath and the next, and Daichi sat with the body for a while, as he had learned to do in his hospice work, marking the transition, honoring the life that had been. And as he sat there, he realized that he had learned more about the Dharma from this old farmer in one conversation than from 15 years of intensive monastery practice. The farmer had not been trying to teach him anything, had not been a spiritual master, had simply been an ordinary man dying an ordinary death. But in his simple presence, in his just being here, he had pointed toward what all the elaborate practices and profound teachings were ultimately about. When Daichi returned to the monastery 6 months later, as Soen had instructed him to do, he was a different person. Or perhaps more accurately, he was the same person but no longer trying to become a different person. The burning desire for enlightenment that had driven him for so long had burned itself out, not because he had achieved enlightenment, but because he had seen through the whole enterprise of trying to achieve it. Soen saw the change in him immediately. When he came to her quarters to report on his time in the village, she looked at him for a long moment and then smiled. "You've stopped trying," she observed. "Yes," Daichi said simply, and I see that I was always what I was trying to become. The seeking was the only obstacle. The practice was the only problem. When I stopped trying to be present and was simply present, when I stopped trying to be enlightened and was simply here, that was what all the teachings were pointing toward." Soen nodded. The Buddha taught that we should not dwell in the past or dream of the future, but concentrate the mind on the present moment. You spent 15 years trying to concentrate your mind on the present moment, and that very trying kept you from actually being present. The present moment is not something you achieve through concentration. It's what's here when you stop trying to achieve anything, when you stop adding extra layers of practice and seeking and striving to the simple fact of existence. Daichi thought about this. So was all that practice wasted? Did I spend 15 years chasing something that was already here? The practice was not wasted, Sowen said. You needed to exhaust yourself with seeking before you could stop seeking. You needed to try as hard as you could before you could see that trying was the obstacle. The journey was necessary even though it brought you back to where you started. You could not have received what Tanaka showed you if you had not first spent years trying to achieve what he showed you could not be achieved. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the monastery grounds where monks were working in the garden, raking paths, going about their daily practice. Some people come to the monastery already knowing this, she continued. They practice, but without grasping, without seeking, without turning it into a project of self-improvement. For them, practice is simply expression of what already is, not an attempt to achieve what is not yet. But most people like you, like I was, need to first chase enlightenment before we can stop chasing it. We need to try to grasp freedom before we can open our hands and find that freedom was never something to be grasped. Daichi returned to the monastery's routine, but everything was different now, even though nothing had changed. He still sat in meditation, still worked in the gardens, still attended Dharma talks. But he was no longer doing these things to get somewhere, to achieve something, to become enlightened. He was simply doing them because they were what this moment contained, what this life included. When he sat, he was just sitting. When he worked, he was just working. When he walked, he was just walking. Not as a practice, not as a technique, but a simple presence with what was actually happening. Sometimes the old patterns would reassert themselves, the comparing, the evaluating, the subtle tracking of progress. But now he could see these patterns arising, could recognize them as the mind doing what minds do, and could choose not to feed them with belief and investment. They were just thoughts, just movements in consciousness, not truth about reality or problems that needed to be solved. One day, a young monk approached him, someone who had recently arrived at the monastery with the same burning desire for enlightenment that Daichi had brought 15 years earlier. The young monk had heard about Daichi's time at the hospital and wanted to know if he had achieved enlightenment there, if working with the dying had somehow produced the breakthrough that monastery practice had not. Daichi smiled, recognizing his younger self in this eager questioner. I didn't achieve anything, he said. I stopped achieving. I stopped seeking. I stopped trying to become enlightened. And in that stopping, I found that what I had been seeking was already here, had always been here, was here even when I was seeking it elsewhere. So should I stop practicing? The young monk asked, confused. Should I leave the monastery and work at the hospital? No, Daichi said gently. You should practice wholeheartedly, with complete dedication, until you exhaust yourself with seeking. You need to chase enlightenment with everything you have, until you finally see that you are chasing your own tail, that the seeker and the sought are not separate, that what you are trying to achieve is what you already are. I can tell you this, but you won't believe it until you discover it for yourself. So practice. Sit zazen. Work on koans. Attend session. Do all of it with complete sincerity. And when you've tried hard enough, when you've sought long enough, when you've practiced intensely enough, then perhaps you'll be ready to stop. And in that stopping, to find what practice was always pointing toward. The young monk bowed and returned to his cushion, and Daichi watched him go with compassion, knowing the journey ahead of him, knowing both its necessity and its ultimate futility, knowing that some truths can only be learned by first trying very hard to learn them, and then discovering that they are never truths that could be learned at all, only recognized as what was always already the case. The monastery bell rang, calling the monks to evening meditation. Daichi stood and walked toward the meditation hall, his feet making soft sounds on the wooden floor, his breath moving in and out without effort or attention, his mind not empty but simply open, not concentrated but simply present, not enlightened but simply here, in this moment, in this life, in the Achith. His existence that required nothing more from him than his willingness to show up for it, exactly as it was. The present moment, he had finally understood, was not something to be achieved or maintained or perfected. It was simply what was here when you stopped trying to be anywhere else. And that was enough. More than enough. Everything. We have journeyed through valleys and monasteries, sat with the dying and watched potters shape emptiness. Learned that seeking often obscures what we seek, and that returning home sometimes means traveling the farthest distance. And now we come to a story about a different kind of journey, not outward into the world or inward towards some distant realization, but downward into the difficult terrain of grief, where all our spiritual understanding is tested against the raw fact of loss. In a city where ancient temples stood beside modern buildings and the old ways persisted beneath the surface of contemporary life, there lived a meditation teacher named Ayako. She had practiced for 25 years, had studied with renowned masters, had led countless retreats where she guided students through the terrain of their own minds with compassion and skill. People came to her with their suffering, anxiety, depression, relationship struggles, the general dissatisfaction that Buddhists call dukkha. And she helped them find peace through mindfulness, through presence, through the cultivation of equanimity in the face of life's inevitable difficulties. She taught that everything is impermanent, that attachment is the root of suffering, that we must learn to hold life lightly, to not cling to what cannot be kept, to accept the constant flow of arising and passing that characterizes all existence. She spoke of these teachings with authority and eloquence, illustrated them with stories and metaphors, embodied them in her calm demeanor and steady presence. Her students trusted her because she seemed to have found what they were seeking, a way to live with life's difficulties without being destroyed by them, a peace that could weather any storm. Then her daughter died. Miyu was 17. Bright and curious and full of the particular intensity of adolescence, that time when everything feels absolute and urgent and world-shaking. She had been walking home from school with friends when a car ran a red light, jumped the curb, and in an instant transformed the trajectory of multiple lives. 2 of her friends were injured. Miyu died at the scene, before the ambulance arrived, before anyone could say goodbye, before Ayako even knew what had happened. The call came while Ayako was teaching a class on accepting impermanence. She was explaining to her students how resistance to change creates suffering, how we must learn to meet each moment as it is without demanding it be different, how peace comes from releasing our grip on what we cannot control. Her phone, which she normally kept silenced during teachings, began to ring. Something made her look at it, some instinct that this call was different. She excused herself and stepped into the hallway, and the police officer on the other end spoke words that seemed to come from very far away, words that made no sense, even as she understood them perfectly. There was an accident. Your daughter. We need you to come to the hospital. I'm sorry. But class continued without her. The students eventually realizing something was wrong, gathering their things in confused silence and leaving. Ayako drove to the hospital in a state that was neither numbness nor feeling, but something suspended between the two, a kind of shocked disbelief that kept reality at bay for just a little while longer, that allowed her to function, to navigate traffic, to park the car, to walk through the emergency room doors, to follow a nurse down a corridor to a room where her daughter lay still and silent under a white sheet. They let her stay as long as she wanted. She sat beside Miyu's body, held her cooling hand, looked at her face still beautiful, unmarked, as though she might open her eyes at any moment and ask what was wrong. Why was everyone looking at her like that? But the stillness was absolute. Whatever had animated that body, whatever spark had made Miyu who she was, had gone somewhere Ayako could not follow. She tried to access her practice, tried to find the equanimity she had cultivated over decades of meditation. This is impermanence, she told herself. This is what I've been teaching about. Everything that arises must pass. Nothing lasts. I knew this. I've always known this. But knowing it as an abstract principle and feeling her daughter's hand growing cold in her own were such vastly different things that the gap between them seemed unbridgeable. The funeral was a blur. People came, students, fellow teachers, friends, family, and spoke words of comfort that slid past her without purchase. They told her that Miyu was in a better place, that everything happens for a reason, that time would heal this wound. Some of them, knowing she was a Buddhist teacher, spoke of karma and rebirth, suggesting that perhaps this was part of some larger pattern she couldn't see, that Miyu's death served some purpose in the great tapestry of existence. Ayako said nothing. She accepted their condolences with mechanical grace, performed the rituals that needed to be performed, arranged what needed to be arranged, and through it all, she felt like she was watching herself from a great distance. A character in a play performing the role of grieving mother with technical competence but no real feeling. The feeling came later, after everyone had gone home, after the rituals were complete, after she was alone in the house that still contained Miyu's room, with Miyu's things arranged exactly as she had left them that last morning, never knowing she would not return. The feeling came in waves so overwhelming that Ayako sometimes thought they would drown her, pull her under into depths from which she could not surface. She tried to practice. She sat on her meditation cushion and tried to be present with the grief, to observe it without being consumed by it, to maintain the witness consciousness she had cultivated through years of practice. But the grief was too large, too total. It filled every space, obliterated all distance. There was no witness, no observer separate from the observed. There was only pain, raw and immediate and absolute. For weeks she could not teach. She cancelled her classes, withdrew from scheduled retreats, declined invitations to speak. How could she teach about accepting impermanence when she could not accept this? How could she guide others toward equanimity when she had none? How could she speak about letting go when every cell in her body was screaming to hold on, to bring her daughter back, to undo what could not be undone? She felt like a fraud. All those years of teaching, all those students she had helped, all that practice, and when it actually mattered, when she faced real loss, the kind of loss that tears the world apart, none of it was enough. The peace she had cultivated evaporated like morning mist. The equanimity she had embodied revealed itself as shallow, conditional, dependent on circumstances that had now been shattered. She had taught from a place of relative comfort, had spoken about accepting difficulty without having faced this particular difficulty, had believed she understood suffering without having encountered suffering of this magnitude. One afternoon, about 2 months after Miyu's death, Ayako went to visit her own teacher, Master Sato, an elderly monk who lived in a small temple on the outskirts of the city. She had not seen him since the funeral, had not been able to face him, had been too ashamed of her inability to practice with her grief, too aware of the gap between what she taught and what she was living. He greeted her with his usual warmth, made tea in silence, and they sat together in his simple room, looking out at the garden where maple leaves were beginning to turn red. Finally, she spoke, and the words came out in a rush, all the pain and confusion and shame she had been holding. "I can't practice," she said. "I try to sit with the grief, to be present with it, to accept it, but I can't. I can't accept that she's gone. I can't be equanimous about this. I can't let go. Everything I've taught, everything I've practiced, it's all useless. I thought I understood the Dharma, but I understand nothing. I thought I had developed some capacity to meet difficulty, but this has completely undone me." Master Sato listened without interrupting, his old eyes full of compassion. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by her own words, he sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "Who told you," he said gently, "that practice means not feeling grief?" The question stopped her. The teachings about equanimity, about non-attachment, about accepting impermanence." "Yes," he said. "And do you think equanimity means not caring? Do you think non-attachment means not loving? Do you think accepting impermanence means not grieving when what we love is taken from us?" Ayako felt tears starting, though she had thought herself cried out. "But I teach people to find peace with difficulty, to not be overwhelmed by their emotions, to maintain presence even in hard times." "And you think," Master Sato said softly, "that being present with overwhelming grief means not being overwhelmed? You think presence means staying separate from what you're experiencing, maintaining some distance, some observer who watches but doesn't feel?" He poured more tea, his movements slow and deliberate. "The Buddha taught that life is dukkha, unsatisfactory, marked by suffering. He taught this not to help us escape from feeling, but to help us stop creating extra suffering on top of the suffering that's already here. Your daughter has died. That is suffering, real suffering, deep suffering. And you are grieving, as any mother would grieve, as any human being would grieve when someone they love is torn from the world. This grief is not a failure of practice. This grief is love with nowhere to go. But I can't function, Ayako said. I can't teach. I can't help people. I can barely take care of myself. Of course, he said. How could you function normally when something abnormal has happened? How could you continue as before when your world has been shattered? The desire to keep functioning, to maintain your role as teacher, to present yourself as someone who has transcended suffering. This is where the extra suffering comes from. Not from the grief itself, but from the belief that you shouldn't be feeling it, that you should be able to rise above it, that it represents some failure on your part. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. Thich Nhat Hanh taught that we should be present with the present moment. Right now, in this present moment, you are grieving. That is what is actually happening. Not equanimity, not acceptance, not peace, grieving. To be present with this moment means to be present with grief, to allow it, to feel it fully, rather than trying to transcend it or fix it or make it different. This is practice. This is what presence actually means. Ayako sat with this, feeling something shift in her chest, some tight knot of resistance beginning to loosen. But it's so painful, she whispered. It's unbearable. And yet, Master Sato said quietly, you are bearing it. Here you are, still breathing, still living, still feeling. The pain has not destroyed you, though I'm sure it feels like it might. You are strong enough to feel this fully, even though you wish you didn't have to. He paused, then continued. The Buddha also taught about the two arrows. The first arrow is the unavoidable pain of existence. Sickness, old age, death, separation from what we love. This arrow strikes everyone. We cannot avoid it. But the second arrow is the one we shoot into ourselves, the judgment, the resistance, the belief that we shouldn't be feeling what we're feeling, the shame about our own suffering. The second arrow is what practice can help us with, not by making us not feel the first arrow, but by helping us stop shooting the second one. So I should just feel it? Ayako asked. Just let myself grieve without trying to practice with it. Feeling it is the practice, Master Sato said. Being present with exactly what is happening, without wishing it were different, without judging yourself for feeling it, without believing that somewhere you should be having a different experience. This is presence. This is practice. Not something separate from grief, but presence with grief, intimacy with grief, allowing grief to be exactly what it is. Ayako felt tears streaming down her face now, but they felt different than before. Before, she had cried while fighting the crying, grieving while resisting the grief, suffering while believing she shouldn't be suffering. Now, she cried while just crying, grieved while just grieving, allowed the pain to be what it was without the second layer of pain that came from judging it. I miss her so much, she said, and saying it without any attempt to spiritualize it or find meaning in it or transcend it felt like a relief, like finally telling the truth. I know, Master Sato said, and you will continue to miss her. The grief may change over time, it usually does, but it won't simply go away. How could it? She was your daughter. You loved her. That love doesn't stop just because she's no longer here. The grief is that love continuing, expressing itself in her absence. They sat together in silence, and Ayako felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, a small space of peace, not because the grief had lessened, but because she had stopped fighting it, stopped believing it represented some failure, stopped shooting the second arrow into the wound that was already there. Can I still teach? She asked eventually. How can I teach when I'm like this? Master Sato smiled slightly. You will teach differently now. Before, you taught from understanding. Now you will teach from experience. Before, you taught about suffering. Now you teach from within it. This will make you a better teacher, though it comes at a price no one would choose to pay. Over the following months, Ayako slowly returned to teaching. But Master Sato was right, she taught differently now. She no longer presented practice as a way to rise above difficulty or transcend suffering. She taught it as a way to be fully present with difficulty, to meet suffering with kindness rather than resistance, to allow ourselves to feel what we actually feel rather than what we think we should feel. Her students noticed the change. Some were uncomfortable with it. They had come to meditation seeking escape from their pain, not a method for being more intimately present with it. But others found in her new teaching something more honest, more helpful, more true to their actual experience. She spoke less about equanimity as a kind of untouchability and more about equanimity as a deep acceptance of the full range of human experience, including the experiences we would never choose. She continued to grieve. Some days were harder than others. Some days she could function almost normally. Some days the weight of Miyu's absence was so heavy she could barely get out of bed. She learned not to judge the hard days, not to believe they meant she was failing or regressing or doing something wrong. They were just hard days, part of the landscape of grief, and she learned to move through them with as much gentleness toward herself as she could muster. One evening, about a year after Miyu's death, Ayako was sitting in meditation when she had an experience that surprised her. She was not trying to achieve anything, not seeking any particular state, just sitting with what was present, which that evening included a deep ache of missing her daughter. And in the midst of that ache, she felt something else, a sense of Miyu's presence, not as a ghost or vision or anything supernatural, but as a kind of warmth in her heart, a quality of love that was still alive even though Miyu was not. She realized that grief was not the opposite of love, but its continuation. As long as she grieved, Miyu was still present in her life, still shaping her experience, still mattering. The grief was painful, yes, unbearably painful sometimes, but it was also a form of connection, a way that love persisted beyond the boundaries of life and death. To stop grieving would mean to stop loving, and she could not do that, would not do that, even if it were possible. This realization did not make the grief easier, but it changed her relationship to it. She stopped seeing it as something to overcome and started seeing it as something to honor, a testament to a love that death could not erase, a bond that persisted even when one half of it had passed beyond reach. She thought of the teaching about the present moment being the only time over which we have dominion. In each present moment, she could choose how to meet her grief with resistance or acceptance, with judgment or kindness, with the belief that she should be different than she was, or with compassion for herself exactly as she was. She could not choose not to grieve, but she could choose to grieve with presence, to allow it rather than fight it, to let it move through her rather than trying to wall it off. And slowly, through this practice of being present with grief, rather than trying to transcend it, she found a kind of peace, not the peace of no pain, but the peace of acceptance, of no longer being at war with her own experience, of allowing life to be exactly what it was, including the parts that broke her heart. When students asked her how to practice with great loss, she told them the truth. There is no practice that makes it not hurt. There is only the practice of being present with the hurt, of allowing yourself to feel it fully, of meeting it with kindness rather than resistance. The pain is the pain. Practice doesn't make it go away. Practice helps you stop creating extra suffering on top of it. And perhaps this is the deepest teaching. That presence doesn't mean transcendence. That acceptance doesn't mean not caring. That practice is not about rising above our human experience, but about being fully human, feeling everything we feel, loving what we love, grieving what we lose, and continuing, to show up for life even when it breaks our hearts. Even in grief, especially in grief, the present moment is all we have. And being present with grief, really present, is its own kind of grace. We have traveled through many landscapes of understanding, gardens that taught acceptance, moons that revealed the difference between concept and direct experience, vessels that discovered their purpose in emptiness. Each story has been a finger pointing, and perhaps you have noticed that all the fingers point toward the same moon, the same simple truth that hides in plain sight, closer than breathing, more obvious than the ground beneath our feet. Let me take you now to the final story. Though of course there is no final story, no ultimate teaching, no last word that can capture what cannot be captured in words. This is a story about coming home, about the journey that ends where it began, about discovering that what we sought in distant temples was waiting patiently in the very place we started. In a city by the sea, where ancient temples stood beside modern buildings, and the old ways persisted alongside the new, there lived a woman named Yuki, who had spent 25 years searching for enlightenment. She had studied with masters across 3 continents, had learned meditation techniques from a dozen different traditions, had attended retreats where silence was maintained for months, and others where chanting continued for days. She had read hundreds of books, had memorized sutras in 3 languages, could discuss the finer points of Buddhist philosophy with scholars and monastics. She had practiced Vipassana and Zen, Tibetan Buddhism and Theravada, had done prostrations and circumambulations, had learned to work with her breath and her mind and the subtle energies that the texts described flowing through channels in the body. She had sat through pain and bliss, through boredom and insight, through doubt and faith. She had given years of her life to the search, had sacrificed relationships and career opportunities, had lived simply and practiced diligently, always seeking that final breakthrough, that ultimate realization that would finally deliver the peace and freedom the teachings promised. And yet, after 25 years, she felt no closer to enlightenment than when she had begun. She understood more, certainly. She had insights and realizations. She could maintain equanimity in situations that once would have disturbed her. Her meditation practice was stable, and her mind was trained. But the fundamental seeking had not ceased. She was still looking for something, still reaching for a state or experience or understanding that remained just beyond her grasp, still convinced that one more teacher, one more technique, one more insight would finally give her what she lacked. She was 50 years old now, and tired of searching, tired of hoping, tired of the subtle violence she did to herself with her constant evaluation of whether she was progressing or regressing on the path, whether her practice was deep enough, whether she was really getting it or just fooling herself. The very concept of a path had become exhausting. The idea that she was somewhere trying to get somewhere else, that she was incomplete and needed to become complete, that she was unenlightened and needed to become enlightened. One autumn morning, Yuki woke in her small apartment and realized she could not continue. Not that she was giving up exactly, but that the whole enterprise of seeking enlightenment had become its own form of suffering, its own kind of trap. The Buddha had taught that attachment causes suffering, and she saw now that her attachment to becoming enlightened was as much a source of suffering as any worldly attachment. Perhaps more so because it was so subtle, so seemingly justified, so sanctioned by every teaching she had encountered. She decided to stop, not to stop meditating or practicing, but to stop seeking, to stop trying to get somewhere, to stop treating the present moment as inadequate and some future moment as the one when she would finally arrive. She would simply live, simply be present with her actual life rather than constantly evaluating it against some ideal of what an enlightened life should look like. That morning, she made tea the way she always made tea, boiling water and steeping leaves and pouring the amber liquid into a simple cup. But for the first time in years, she was not making tea while thinking about her practice, or planning her day, or reviewing what she had learned in her latest study. She was just making tea. Filling the kettle, lighting the burner, waiting for the water to boil, warming the pot, measuring the leaves, pouring, waiting, pouring again into the cup. Each action complete in itself, not a means to something else, not a step on a path to somewhere better. Just this. Water becoming tea, cold becoming hot, leaves releasing their essence into liquid. The simple transformation of elements that had been happening for thousands of years before she was born, and would continue for thousands of years after she was gone. She sat by the window and drank the tea, and the tea tasted like tea, which is to say it tasted like exactly what it was, nothing more and nothing less. Not enlightened tea, not mundane tea, just tea. And in that simplicity, in that complete ordinariness, something relaxed in her that had been tense for 25 years. She thought of a teaching she had heard long ago from Shunryu Suzuki. Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement. The paradox had always puzzled her. How could she be perfect and also need improvement? But she saw now that the puzzle dissolved when you stopped treating perfection as a future state to be achieved, and saw it as simply what is, as the inherent completeness of each moment exactly as it already is. The cup of tea was perfect, not because it was the best tea or because she had made it perfectly, but because it was completely itself, fully present as tea in a cup on a morning in autumn. And she was perfect in the same way, not because she had achieved some special state, not because she had become enlightened, but simply because she was here, now, completely herself, this 50-year-old woman drinking tea by a window, no more and no less than that. The improvement she could use was not to become something other than what she was, but to recognize what she already was. To stop overlaying the simple reality of existence with concepts about enlightenment and delusion, progress and regression, success and failure on some imaginary spiritual path. She finished the tea and washed the cup, and the washing of the cup was complete in itself, not preparation for the next thing, but simply washing, simply the meeting of water and ceramic and hands. The removal of tea stains, the return of the cup to cleanliness. She dried it and put it away, and the putting away was complete in itself. She dressed and walked to the market to buy vegetables for dinner, and the walking was just walking, the buying was just buying. She greeted the vegetable seller, an old woman she had seen countless times over the years but never really noticed, never really seen, because she was always in her head, always thinking about her practice, always somewhere else, even when her body was standing at the market stall. But today she saw the woman really saw her. The lined face and quick smile, the practiced hands selecting the best vegetables, the easy banter with regular customers. This woman had probably never heard of enlightenment, had probably never spent a day in meditation, had no concept of Buddhist philosophy or spiritual practice. She just sold vegetables day after day, year after year, meeting each customer with the same friendly efficiency, the same presence with what she was actually doing. Was she enlightened? The question seemed suddenly absurd. She was herself, completely and unself-consciously herself, living her life without the burden of trying to become something other than what she was. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything. Yuki bought bok choy and mushrooms and lotus root, and she walked home through streets she had walked 1,000 times, but now she saw them. The light slanting between buildings, creating geometric patterns of sun and shadow. The sound of traffic and conversation and distant music. The smell of cooking from restaurants and street vendors. The feeling of pavement under her feet, solid and reliable. The earth still there beneath concrete and asphalt, still supporting everything, still present even when forgotten. She had spent 25 years seeking enlightenment in temples and retreat centers and meditation halls, sitting in silence and studying texts and working with teachers, and all that had value perhaps. All that had taught her things, had trained her mind, had given her tools and understanding. But the enlightenment she sought was not in any of those places. It was here, in these ordinary streets, in this simple walk home with vegetables in a bag, in this moment of sun and shadow and the sound of the city living its life. Thich Nhat Hanh had taught that there is no way to happiness. Happiness is the way. And she saw now what that meant. There was no way to enlightenment. Enlightenment was the way. It was not a destination to arrive at after sufficient practice and effort. It was the simple presence with what is. The end of seeking something other than this moment. The recognition that there is nowhere to go because you are already here. Nothing to become because you already are. She prepared dinner that evening with full attention, chopping vegetables with care, heating oil, adding ingredients at the right moment, tasting and adjusting seasoning. Not mindfulness as a practice to develop some future capacity, but simple presence with the actual activity of cooking. The transformation of raw ingredients into a meal, the ancient alchemy of fire and food that had sustained human life since humans first learned to control flame. She ate alone, slowly, tasting each bite, feeling the textures, experiencing the simple satisfaction of hunger being fed. No television, no book, no distraction, just eating while eating, being present with this most basic of activities, this fundamental exchange of nutrients that kept her body alive. After dinner, she sat by the window as darkness fell and watched the city lights come on, the windows of 1,000 apartments glowing against the darkening sky. In each window, someone was living their life, cooking dinner, watching television, putting children to bed, arguing with a spouse, reading a book, sitting alone. Ordinary lives, unmarked by any special spiritual achievement, yet each one complete. Each one the universe expressing itself through that particular form, that unique combination of circumstances and genetics and history. She thought of all the years she had spent trying to transcend the ordinary, trying to achieve something special, trying to become someone other than who she was. And she saw the violence in it, the subtle rejection of life as it actually is, the constant message to herself that this moment is not enough, that she is not enough, that somewhere else or some other time or some other state of consciousness is what she really needs. But this moment was enough. This breath was enough. This body, aging and imperfect, was enough. This mind, with its thoughts and emotions and habits, was enough. Not because they were particularly good or special or spiritual, but simply because they were what is actually here, the only reality available to be lived. She remembered a koan she had worked with years ago. What is your original face before your parents were born? The question had puzzled her, had led her into elaborate philosophical speculation about Buddha nature and emptiness and the self beyond the self. But now she saw a simpler answer. Her original face was this face, here, now. Not some mystical essence hidden beneath layers of conditioning, but simply this awareness experiencing itself through this particular form, consciousness being conscious through these eyes, life living itself through this body. Before her parents were born, this face did not exist. After her death, this face will not exist. But right now, right here, this is the face of existence, the face of life, the face of reality. And it is perfect not because it is beautiful or achieved or enlightened, but simply because it is real, because it is what actually is, rather than what she thinks should be. Over the following days and weeks, Yuki noticed a profound shift in her relationship to practice. She still meditated each morning, but not as a means to become enlightened. She meditated because sitting in stillness was what she was doing in that moment, because the body and breath were here and awareness was naturally present with them. Not practice for some future benefit, but simple presence with what is actually happening. She still read Dharma books occasionally, but not as instruction manuals for achieving enlightenment. She read them the way she might read poetry, allowing the words to point towards something beyond themselves, enjoying the elegance of the pointing without grasping at what was being pointed toward, without trying to possess it or achieve it or make it her own. She still went to the temple sometimes, still sat with the Sangha, still listened to Dharma talks, but she no longer evaluated everything against whether it was bringing her closer to enlightenment. She simply participated because that was what she was doing, because being part of a community of practice had its own value, its own completeness, regardless of where it was leading or what it was achieving. The seeking had stopped, not because she had found what she was seeking, but because she had seen through the seeking itself, had recognized it as just another form of suffering, another way of rejecting the present moment in favor of an imagined future moment that would somehow be better, more complete, more satisfying. And in the absence of seeking, there was just this, life living itself, moment by moment, breath by breath, making tea and drinking tea and washing the cup, walking to the market and buying vegetables and cooking dinner, sitting by the window and watching the light change, sleeping and waking and beginning again. Was this enlightenment? The question seemed to miss the point. Enlightenment was a concept, an idea about a special state that the mind could grasp at, could seek, could imagine achieving. But reality was beyond concepts, beyond the mind's categories of enlightened and unenlightened, beyond the whole structure of spiritual achievement and progress and arriving. Reality was simply this: tea tasting like tea, morning light on the wall, breath moving in and out, the ordinary miracle of existence happening moment by moment by moment. Not special, not mystical, not transcendent, just real. Just here, just now. She thought of the young woman she had been 25 years ago, full of hunger for enlightenment, convinced that ordinary life was something to transcend, that the answer lay in some special practice or teaching or experience. She felt compassion for that young woman, for her sincerity and dedication, for the years she had given to the search. It had not been wasted exactly. The search itself had been part of the journey, had been necessary perhaps, had taught her things. But the search had to end for the finding to happen, and the finding was nothing like what she had expected. It was not a dramatic breakthrough or a special state of consciousness. It was just the simple recognition that she was already home, had always been home, that there was nowhere to go and nothing to achieve and no one to become, because she was already here, already complete, already fully herself in this moment exactly as it is. The Buddha had taught that we should not dwell in the past or dream of the future, but concentrate the mind on the present moment. Not because the present moment is always pleasant or perfect, but because it is the only moment that actually exists, the only moment we can actually live in, the only moment that is real. And this moment, this very moment as you read these words, is enough. You are enough. Not because you have achieved something, or because you have practiced enough, or because you have become enlightened, but simply because you are here, because awareness is aware, because existence is existing through this particular form, this unique expression of life. There is nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, no one to become. The journey is already complete. You are already home. You have always been home. The only thing that was ever missing was the recognition of what was already here, already true, already complete. This is the teaching. This is the pointing. This is the finger indicating the moon. But the moon itself, the moon is right there, right here, right now, closer than your own breath, more obvious than the ground beneath your feet, as simple and complete and perfect as tea tasting like tea on an ordinary morning in autumn.